What you are about to hear represents one of the most important historical revelations in human history. Using genetic analysis, archaeological evidence, ecology, paleoclimatology, cultural memory encoded in mythology, linguistic forensics, and institutional documentation, we can now prove that the same elite networks often descended from specific male lineages have dominated human civilization for 6,000 years. Through an evolving but unchanging system of extraction and domination, they imposed themselves repeatedly over earlier societies. This is part 1 of 2 to the introduction of Blood and Stone, a 30-chapter series representing 6,000 pages of research across 30 chapters in the source material. Where Hancock and von Daniken invoke floods, pyramids, and aliens to explain civilizational patterns, this text instead leans on real and measurable phenomena. Y chromosome bottlenecks, and ancient DNA, linguistically reconstructed Proto-Indo-European and Semitic words and myths, institutional continuity of scribal, priestly, and banking roles. We will focus on skull cults and the long skulls of Neanderthal and Denisovans, along with the fact artificial cranial elongation or head binding, which is well documented across 10,000 years, signaled elite lineages, not aliens. We also use archaeological evidence for violent population replacement. Our work resembles something much closer to Carroll Quigley, author of Tragedy and Hope, who focused on elite continuity, financial networks, and institutional power rather than mystical or extraterrestrial explanations. And where Quigley traced networks of bankers, lawyers, and aristocrats from 17th-20th century Europe. This thesis attempts to extend that pattern back 6,000 years, arguing that the triumvirate of military, religious, financial control has deeper roots. Differences. Quigley focused on modern Western networks, for example, Milner Group Round Table, while this text pushes much further back and ties to the East. Quigley did not propose genetic continuity. He framed elites as institutional, not biological. This text heavily integrates archaeogenetics, which Quigley never had access to. As Bruce Lincoln argues, religions should be understood not as divine revelations, but as historical artifacts. Myths, crafted by elites to legitimize power, sanctify conquest, and naturalize social hierarchies. Rather than revealing eternal truths, they veil the very real histories of domination and colonization that gave rise to them. This work combines siloed fields into a grand synthesis of respected resources from top academics in their fields, to tell a story that cannot be told in the current academic compartmentalized scientific state we are in today. DNA analysis can trace bloodlines across millennia. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic population replacements. Corporate archives document institutional continuity. Linguistic analysis shows phonemic preservation across thousands of years. When you combine all this evidence, an impossible picture emerges. The same genetic networks that established the first empires in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago are running the Federal Reserve, BlackRock, and the World Bank today. The same bloodlines that imposed Skyfather religions on conquered populations still control the Vatican, major Jewish institutions, and Islamic leadership. The same families that financed medieval crusades orchestrated both world wars and every major conflict since. This isn't ancient history. This is the operating system of the contemporary world, and for the first time we have the scientific evidence to prove it. To understand the 6,000-year matrix, we must begin with the greatest crime in human history, one that has been downplayed for decades, the Y-DNA bottleneck of Eurasia. Between 4,500 and 2,800 years before the Common Era, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppes launched the most systematic genocide and population replacement in recorded history. These Kurgan peoples, carrying distinctive R1B and R1A and J2 genetic markers, didn't just conquer Europe and the Middle East. They replaced the existing male populations almost entirely. But the Kurgan expansion was only the opening move. Around 3,300–2,500 BCE, their descendants, the Yamnaya Bamak Sintashta among others, evolved and deployed the full template. They spread from the Pontic-Caspian steppe with horses, wheeled vehicles, and organized chariot warfare, replacing not just populations but entire ruling classes. Unlike the earlier Kurgan incursion, the Yamnaya expansion was faster, more coordinated, and more complete. They didn't merely conquer those, they installed their social hierarchy, their language family, and their elite lineages from Britain to India. The Yamnaya were the storm after the drought, the pale horse riders of the Bronze Age apocalypse. Recent genetic research from David Reich's laboratory has confirmed this overwrite in stunning detail. Reich and his team analyzed hundreds of ancient genomes and discovered what they termed the Great Male Lineage Bottleneck. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, up to 95% of Eurasian male lineages vanished, replaced almost entirely by Yamnaya-descended R1B and R1A lineages. This was not gradual assimilation, but a targeted overwrite, an elite-driven genetic coup that left Neolithic G2A Halpa group farming populations erased from the paternal record. In Britain, up to 90% of Neolithic male lines disappeared. In Iberia, nearly complete replacement occurred within centuries. Reich also demonstrated that Indo-European languages spread not through trade or cultural diffusion, but through systematic elite replacement. Modern European and Near Eastern paternal lines still carry this signature. Before 1000 BCE, most Europeans still carried darker skin alleles, with lighter pigmentation being rare and concentrated. Archaeogenetic studies show that light skin alleles, particularly among steppe-descended R1B and R1A lineages, were more common among elite males who displaced earlier Neolithic farmers. This suggests that pale skin was initially a visible marker of outsider or ruling class status, a quote-unquote elite trait brought by conquerors, long before it became widespread in the general population through natural selection. The arrival of these steppe elites was remembered in mythology as a deluge, not merely as a literal flood, but as a cultural memory of ecological disaster, invasion, and societal reset. From India to Greece to the Levant, stories tell of pale-skinned flood gods or savior figures who arrive after catastrophe to found a new order. In India, he was an Aryan called Manu, the lawgiver who survives the flood given to them by Aryan invaders. In Greece, Deucalion. In the Levant, this became the figure of Noah, described in Ethiopian and Jewish traditions as unusually light-skinned or albino-like, symbolizing the foreign elite who replaced the darker, older populations. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim, in the Germanic north, Odin arrives from the east with sky god knowledge, the bright flood, savior, China Yu. These aren't mere legends. They encode the memory of Kurgan and Yamnaya elites riding into collapsed agricultural societies, imposing new religions, replacing local rulers, and refounding civilization in their image. These stories, spread from the steppes to India and the Levant, encoded the cultural authority of priest kings and their divine legitimacy as founders of civilization after the collapse of earlier societies. Following Bruce Lincoln, we can read religion as history disguised, mythologized accounts of conquest and hierarchy, crafted to sanctify domination and maintain order. While Graham Hancock speculates the shared flood mythology around the globe represents the younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, our data suggests these stories reflect real ecological disaster, just 5,900, 4,200, and 3,200 years ago. The 5.9 kilo-year event in 3900 BC represents a severe weather period which forced migrations out of different areas through floods and droughts. Melting of the remains of the last glacial ice age caused flooding in Asia. While not to be taken literally but as a functional launch pad for their cultural memory, this year coincides with the Masoretic timeline in Jewish texts for the timeline of Adam. Year 1 is the year 3900 BC on our calendars, the same window as the 5.9 kilo-year event. A migration would have been encoded in an exit from a garden, and Sarrazin experiences migrations around this time with braided flowing rivers into one of the first Asian cities. Sarrazin, which means the beginning of the earth, or where the earth begins, and whose location matches biblical descriptions for the Garden of Eden, Eden being steppe or plains in Akkadian Semitic with no word for Eden, with an E in any Semitic language. Sarrazin, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recently discovered in 2010 and vastly underappreciated for its possibilities. Even Shambhala, a theoretical Indian and Chinese holy place found in religions given to them by invaders from the north and east respectively, is described as a place in the north or a center of the universe in legends. Meanwhile, Sarasm is almost directly north of India and near Khan Tengri, west of China, in the center of Eurasia. Mount Meru described as the center of the world, while Sarasm's valley sits in the center of Eurasia. It is home to the Zerfshan River there, which means spreader of gold, fed by a glacier and near Khan Tengri, home of Tengrism and Buddhism. It sits directly along the Silk Road and was controlled by Sogdians and their predecessors for millennia. Some have speculated that it is the home of Zervanism and Zoroastrianism fire rites. The first monotheistic religion recorded in writing centuries before Judaism, but with a population that also migrated from the northeast into the Levant. All these are religions the steppe warlords spread, as they spread the Indo-European and Indo-Aryan languages and replaced male lines either in elite circles or completely dot. We see this dynamic in India, where the Brahmins today still carry 4-7 times as much R1, a Y DNA, a marker of steppe ancestry, compared to the general population, a genetic legacy of the invaders who imposed a caste system rooted in their own foreign ideology. In India, this story begins. Hinduism, as we know it, emerged not from the peaceful Indus Valley Harappan civilization, 1900 BCE, which was urban, nature-focused, matrifocal, and left behind fire altars, mother goddess figurines, animals, and undeciphered symbols, but from the steppe pastoralists who arrived later. Around 1800–1500 BCE, Indo-Aryans from Central Asia brought with them Sanskrit, chariots, horses, and the oral hymns that became the Rig Veda, inaugurating the Vedic religion, which replaced and absorbed the older Harappan traditions. From about 1500–600 BCE, the Vedic religion dominated northern India, centered on fire sacrifices, yajna, priests, Brahmins, and gods like Indra, Agni, and Varuna. Structured around a rigid social hierarchy, the four Varnas, enshrined in the Rig Veda and Purusha Sukta. Only after 600 BCE, with the Upanishads, Buddhism, and Jainism, did the rigid Vedic system soften into what we now call classical Hinduism, incorporating temples, image worship, and devotional bhakti practices, absorbing indigenous elements and moving beyond the sacrificial orthodoxy. Meanwhile, in the Levant, Judaism too began in this same era, c. 2000–1800 BCE, among Semitic-speaking pastoralist tribes who came into Canaan from the north and east. Archaeology and the Bible itself suggest that early Israelite religion was not strictly monotheistic. It acknowledged multiple deities, Elohim =, gods, and Yahweh was one among them, a storm or warrior god originally. Even the 10 Commandments, "You shall have no other gods before me," implies the existence of other gods, only that Yahweh alone should be worshipped. It was only centuries later, in the first millennium BCE, that exclusive monotheism crystallized, just as in India Hinduism evolved beyond Vedic polytheism, a shared Indo-European and Semitic heritage. What few realize is that the name Manu in India is not unique, but part of an ancient Indo-European linguistic and mythological heritage that also surfaces in Adam, Noah, and Deucalion. The Sanskrit Manu, progenitor lawgiver, comes from the Proto-Indo-European root man, human thinker mind, which also gives us English man, German Mensch, Latin manus, and even mind. Similarly, Hebrew Adam means human or of the earth, again pointing to the archetype of the first human being. Core familial terms like pater, father, and mater, mother, are shared across Indo-European languages: Sanskrit piter mater, Latin pater mater, Greek pater meter, Old English fida moda. These linguistic echoes remind us that Manu, Adam, Noah, and Deucalion emerged from the same ancestral imagination, carried across Eurasia by migrating peoples. The adventures of Abraham in the Levant and the conceptual emergence of Brahma and Manu in India both arise from the same crucible of history, the early second millennium BCE. This was when Indo-European and Semitic elites, armed with chariots, patriarchal law, and skyfather cosmologies, rewrote the social and spiritual orders of the ancient world. Their paths diverged, Judaism evolving toward monotheism, Hinduism toward a synthesis of ritual and devotion, but their origins lie in the same migrations and myths. The priestly lineages of both India and the Near East emerged in the wake of northern chariot-born invaders, hybrid elites blending steppe, Iranian, and local farmer lineages. The Kohen of Israel, KHN, initially without vowels, and the Kanva of India not only share a similar name and role, but both signal the arrival of a new ruling order, armed with chariots, imposing a patriarchal priesthood, and securing power through temples, ritual, and debt. Their KN consonants echo an ancient authority carried by these conquering elites, from the steppes to the valleys. Zhong's 2022 study, The 6,000-Year History of the Steppes in Asia, showed travel through this route by the Kurgan cultures, the Bimak, corded ware, the Yamnaya, and others. He also showed they all met in what would be later Khaganate central areas during the war chariot invention at Sintashta, an ancient deployment zone for the Y DNA replacement that would ensue. One less mentioned vector in the Yamnaya spread is the Turkey to Bimak route in 3000 BC. The Max Planck Institute diagrams this migration in their hybrid Indo-European language origin model. It represents a crucial bridge in the history of control systems. The Hurrian Empire, cultural predecessors of the Hatti, Hittite, Mitanni, and Phrygian empires after them, the Hurrian operating system, the forgotten priests of empire. Long before Sumerians codified writing or Vedic sages praised Indra, the Hurrians had already established the first true religious institutional control system, decentralized, portable, and global in ambition. They emerged around Urkesh in northern Mesopotamia, circa 3000 BCE, and by 2500 BCE, they were embedding themselves into elite bureaucracies and priesthoods from eastern Anatolia to the Zagros foothills, with administrative centers like Naga and Nusi confirming their early bureaucratic sophistication. This was not merely a regional ethnic group. The Hurrians built a stateless, cross-cultural priesthood, preserving their identity while infiltrating Akkadian, Amorite, Hittite, and later Assyrian institutions. Their influence ran so deep that their language was still being used in diplomatic correspondence in the El Amarna letters of Egypt, approximately 1350 BCE, centuries after they had supposedly faded from Anatolia. Two vectors, a global strategy. Archaeogenetic and linguistic evidence confirms that Hurrians split into two migratory arcs during the 3rd millennium BCE. Southern vector, approximately 3000-2000 BCE, moved into Anatolia, influencing Hattian and Hittite culture and eventually forming the Mitanni kingdom, where Indo-Aryan elite warrior elements, for example names like Indra, Mitra, and Varuna, were inserted into Hurrian religious texts. Eastern vector, approximately 2500-1800 BCE. Through Bimak, they reached northwestern India, embedding storm god theology and elite succession myths into Vedic texts. This is how Tesub, the Hurrian storm king, becomes Indra, the warlord of the Rigveda. These vectors demonstrate that Hurrians predate Indra, Baal, and El Elyon, and transmitted the same core ideological structures through oral systems into both India and the Levant. Religion as control software. The Hurrians were not simply worshippers, they were engineers of belief systems, building reusable religious templates deployable across cultures. Tesub, their storm god, later appears as Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, and Indra, always legitimizing elite divine rule through cosmic warfare. Sausa, their love war goddess, is the prototype for Ishtar, Astarte, and Aphrodite, all merging sex, diplomacy, and violence to sanctify both fertility and elite marriage contracts. Kumarbi succession myths encode divine legal succession. These myths prefigure the Greek theogony and El Yahweh's divine court, including motifs of castration, rebellion, and cosmic inheritance. Alani, their underworld goddess, was exported as Alatum, then Allat, and ultimately diffused into the conceptual matrix that would later include Allah. This proves religious continuity across vast semantic shifts. Even El Elyon, the Most High God Abraham tithes to in Genesis 14, reflects Hurrian dynastic myth logic. Sargon of Akkad's own claim to power, that it came from a higher authority of Shamash the sun god, mirrors the Hurrian kingship theology and their god Simage. Elite preservation through flexibility. Unlike the Sumerians or Akkadians, Hurrians never needed to hold territory permanently. They operated via Tupsaru scribes fluent in multiple languages, Sartenu, chief administrators, and treaty makers, myth brokers, and temple contractors. They were the invisible hand of early empire, never the face of power, but always writing its legal codes, managing its archives, and installing its gods. By the Middle Bronze Age, c. 2000–1500 BCE, Hurrians dominate the Mitanni elite. By 1680 BCE, they are running Assyria. Their language disappears in Anatolia around 1200 BCE, but is still spoken by elites in Assyria until 700 BCE, showing elite transfer and the long shadow of a transnational priestly caste. Their influence is present even in Phoenician administrative structures and Levitical priesthoods of the later Hebrews, where temple economy, divine law, and scribal protocol follow Hurrian patterns. Timeline anchors 3000 BCE, Urkesh founded, first Hurrian city-state, 2500–2000 BCE. Hurrian spread to Zagros, Biamak, and northern Syria. 2300 BCE, Tel Bila and Nutsi show Hurrian contract-based land systems. 2000–1500 BCE, formation of Mitannia. Hurrians embed Indo-Aryan deities. 1500–1300 BCE, Hurrian language used in Amana diplomacy. 1200 BCE, Ugaritic texts, Baal, El, Yam, emerge, all reflecting Hurrian core motifs. 700 BCE, last known Hurrian-speaking elite in Assyria, now the global hub of empire. The Hurrians did not merely influence history, they wrote its foundational code. Before Yahweh, before Indra, before Zeus, there was Tesub. Before the Levites kept the law, Hurrian Tupsaru managed the temple tablets. Their genius was not in conquest, but in convergence, embedding the same divine command structure across geographies and tongues without ever revealing the source. From Bactria to Canaan, from Anatolia to Assyria, the Hurrians ran the silent software behind the world's first imperial operating systems. Initially, with no written language of their own, they adopted Akkadian cuneiform, itself an adapted language stolen from Sumerians by nomadic setters from the north. While history overlooks the ties in migration direction, several connections show prior ties for these Semitic nomads and the Hurrian elite. The Khaganate, whose empire spanned from Ukraine to China, would later spread Zuvanism, Buddhism, and Tengrism, and their descending branches would go on to be the Western Khaganate and Khazarians. A combination of Scythian Hun and Alan elites, like their predecessor Kurgan cultures would employ, known as Goths, under Byzantine orders to tax Europe later. The term foederati had its usage and meaning extended by the Romans' practice of subsidizing entire barbarian tribes such as the Franks, Vandals, Alans, Huns, and the Visigoths, the last being the best known in exchange for providing warriors to fight in the Roman armies. Alaric I began his career leading a band of Gothic foederati. The 4.2 kiloyear event in roughly 2200 BC represents another weather event for a century that also led to flooding and aridification. The Indus Valley and Egyptian cultures, which were more advanced, were weakened due to drought and migration. But this window also coincides with the Masoretic timeline for Noah's flood. Also roughly the timeline for Gutian invasions and rise and fall of Akkad, as well as the timeline for the Tower of Babel, all within a 150 years period. More importantly, it coincides with the actual migration of northerners into the region, and the walls we will discuss later in this episode. This timeline represents the cultural myths of Odin and Yu, Manu and Noah almost too conveniently. White flood gods, migrations from the north, subjugation through temple systems, male line interruption, shared chariot technology. The kind von Daniken thinks are the chariot of the gods, more like the chariots of the frauds, the self-proclaimed new temple gods. Sintashta chariots and bad intentions. Sargon declared himself the king of the world, then his future successors declared themselves god of the universe. This was a time when invaders were calling themselves gods and writing mythology that made the new servant class worship them, the very roots to all our religions since the Kurgan invasions. When we speak of Sumerian civilization, the world's first cities, its earliest writing, its first recorded myths, we have to recognize a strange paradox. Almost everything we know about Sumer was written down not by the Sumerians themselves, but by the Akkadian conquerors who replaced them. Sumerian cuneiform was invented in the late 4th millennium BCE to write the Sumerian language, a language with no known relatives, a true isolate. But by around 2000 BCE, Sumerian ceased to be spoken as a living language. The Akkadians, Semitic-speaking northerners who migrated, infiltrated, and attacked old Sumerian cities, established their own dynasty, adopted Sumerian script, and kept the language alive in their scribal schools as a scholarly and liturgical language, much as Latin survived after Rome. Because of this, Almost all the Sumerian myths, hymns, king lists and epics we have today were copied and transmitted by Akkadian scribes hundreds of years after Sumer itself had fallen. These scribes also helpfully left behind bilingual Sumerian Akkadian dictionaries and glossaries, enabling modern scholars to decipher the tablets. So the knowledge of Sumer we possess today comes to us through the hands of their conquerors, the Akkadians, who both obliterated their independence and preserved their memory. Sitchin was born to a Jewish family in 1920 at Baku, the capital of then Soviet Azerbaijan, and raised in Mandatory Palestine, which in 1948 became the modern state of Israel. After supposedly graduating in economics, was an editor and journalist in Israel before moving to New York in 1952. While working as an executive for a shipping company, he taught himself Sumerian cuneiform and visited several archaeological sites. Similar to earlier authors such as Immanuel Velikovsky and Erich von Daniken, Sitchin advocated hypotheses in which extraterrestrial events supposedly played a significant role in ancient human history. The problem? Sitchin translated the Anu or Anunnaki, highest god in the Sumerian pantheon, as those who from heaven came is itself an error or was completely fabricated. And all modern translations of the term in this fashion are merely relying on Sitchin's own publications. Anunnaki actually means princely seed or princely royal blood. When recounting the translations and any subordinate pantheon religion under it afterwards, in that context, you can clearly see the swindle. It would just be another one of many claims to divinity like the ones claimed by the Akkadian invaders years earlier, like kings in Europe who exploited their subjects, dragon lines in Asia, more of the same domestication of the sheeple. When taking into account the Dieux Pater pantheon across Proto-Indo-European languages, this exposes the system even more. Sky Fathers. From Ukraine, where the Yamnaya first merged R1A and R1B lines into one confederation, this spread out in their warpath. The sky over the feather grass-covered steppe in Ukraine. Deus Pater has been translated as Father Sky God. Deus is considered by scholars the most securely reconstructed deity of the Indo-European pantheon, as identical formulas referring to him can be found among the subsequent Indo-European languages and myths of the Vedic Indo-Aryans, Latins, Greeks, Phrygians, Messapians, Thracians, Illyrians, Albanians, and Hittites. This was not normal human evolution. Some have erred them in Proto-Indo-European Tiwaz. Chief sky god Vedic Dios Pitar, Ukraine Dios Pater celestial father, Baltic Dievs Dievas sky ruler, Irish Dagda father figure of power, Old English T war god, Old High German Zu war god, and so on. The shift from the pre-culture era to this new Dios Pater Kurgan steep domination culture shows archaeological evidence that is undeniable. Maria Gimbutas, the Lithuanian archaeologist whose work was suppressed by academic institutions for decades, documented the complete transformation of European society during this period. Peaceful, egalitarian farming communities that had existed for thousands of years were systematically destroyed and replaced by hierarchical militaristic societies. But Gimbutas didn't have access to genetic evidence. We do. And what the DNA tells us is horrifying. In Britain, 90% of the male population was replaced during the Belbeka period, 90%. In Mesopotamia, towns razed and populations scattered. In India, a shift in power structure to invaders through the Aryans, descendants of the same PI languages. In China, Tocharians, a shocking find in the 20th century to see mummies preserved with Scythian features, seemingly far from home. This wasn't gradual migration or cultural influence. This was systematic extermination of the existing population and/or replacement of elite male lines with Kurgan invaders carrying R1B and R1A genetics, a tiny minority of the populations just 5,000 years ago. The same pattern repeats across Europe. In Ireland, the genetic replacement was equally complete. In Germany, France, Spain. Everywhere the Belbeka culture appeared, the original population disappeared and was replaced by Kurgan bloodlines. The Kurgan invasions replaced earlier Neolithic societies that were more balanced and less hierarchical, with limited evidence of organized warfare, fortified settlements, or social stratification. Archaeological evidence suggests these communities practiced agriculture, shared resources more equitably, and honored life-giving and fertility-oriented deities, often represented as goddesses. Women appear to have held higher status than in later patriarchal systems. This more cooperative and cyclical way of life was systematically dismantled by the warrior elites who imposed rigid hierarchies, militarism, and male-dominated skyfather religions. These were agricultural societies based on cycles of renewal, community cooperation, and reverence for life-giving feminine principles. The megalith builders before the invasions. The builders of the Great Pyramid, Stonehenge, and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Mythology was metaphoric and nature-based, not literal sky daddy watching and causing suffering, but a way to track weather and travel through the stars. A way to understand the afterlife, but not a born-in-sin, fear and guilt-based mythology where man is most easily manipulated. There was no priest-warrior-banker class extracting surplus from producers. The genetic markers tell the story. The original Eurasian populations carried majority G2, a paternal DNA, markers associated with peaceful farming communities. These markers virtually disappear from the archaeological record, replaced by R1B Kurgan genetics, in a process so rapid and complete it can only be explained by systematic genocide. But the Kurgans didn't just kill the men and enslave the women. They implemented something far more sophisticated and lasting, a complete control system that would govern human civilization for the next 6,000 years. The Kurgan invaders brought with them a revolutionary innovation in social control, the integration of military force, financial extraction, and religious authority into a single system operated by the same bloodlines. Previous civilizations had warriors, traders, and priests, but these were separate social functions. The Kurgans created something new, warrior priests who controlled both the military and the temples, and who systematized wealth extraction through what we now call banking and taxation. This wasn't random cultural evolution. This was a deliberate control technology as sophisticated in its way as modern surveillance systems or torture-based mind control, and it worked so well that the same basic template still operates today. But the Kurgans also brought something else that would prove crucial for maintaining control across millennia, a phonemic signature. The sound Khan, meaning authority, control, dominion, and power. This wasn't just a word, it was a genetic marker embedded in language itself. Linguistics reveals patterns that even genetic analysis cannot capture. The Khan phoneme appears in the earliest Sumerian cuneiform as the symbol for authority and control. It appears in Egyptian as Kayan under Hyksos invasion by Asiatics. It evolves into Khan for Steppe rulers, Kohen for Jewish priests, Konig for Germanic kings. The KHN consonant cluster persisted from the Sumerian Khan to Akkadian Sharukin, Hebrew Kohen, Phoenician KHN priests of their god, El and Baal, Mongol Khan, Chinese Khan and Chan, India Kanva, Mayan Kanajao, Polynesian Kontiki, Peruvian Kontiki, and even English King and Constantine, an unbroken phenosemantic thread encoding authority. Divine power. Today it still echoes in legitimate authority. Constitutional control, command code, canon. Every time you acknowledge legitimate power, you're using a phonemic signature that traces back 6,000 years to the original Kurgan conquest and the theft of sounds like Khnum in pre-invasion Egypt. Khnum is famously known for creating humans and other living beings from clay on his potter's wheel, a fertility, peaceful god, representing sustenance and passage in the afterlife. A stark difference from the Diospata storm god of the Eurasian Yamnaya Kurgan cultures. This isn't coincidence. This is the linguistic DNA of power itself, preserved across millennia by the same bloodlines that carry the genetic DNA of the original invaders. Two paths from the mountains, Yamnaya and Semitic elites. Around 5000–4000 BCE, the mountains of the Caucasus and the Iranian plateau became the genetic and cultural crossroads of two great lineages that would reshape the ancient world. On one side of the mountains, to the north, the Eastern European hunter-gatherers, EHG, mixed with Caucasus hunter-gatherers, CHG, on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This fusion created the Yamnaya, tall, mobile, horse-riding pastoralists with R1A and R1B paternal lineages. They would expand into Europe and Asia, overwriting Neolithic farmers and establishing the foundation of Indo-European languages and ruling castes. The Yamnaya carried their CHG ancestry north and west, paired with EHG. On the other side of the mountains, to the south, CHG Iranian plateau farmers mixed with Natufian-descended Levantine farmers who already dominated the Fertile Crescent. This fusion gave rise to the Semitic-speaking elites, early Akkadians, Amorites, Hyksos, and later Judeans. These lineages favored J1 and J2 paternal lines and brought the scribal, temple banking, and pastoralist strategies of the vault into Mesopotamia and beyond. Now here's where we track the actual mechanism. How does a confederation from the Ukrainian steppe end up controlling temple banks in Mesopotamia? It's not one invasion, it's a multi-stage deployment. Step 1, Sredny Stog culture emerges on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. For the first time in human history, we see EHG and CHG ancestry mixing substantially. And crucially, this creates the first population carrying both major light-skin alleles together. SLC24A5 from their CHG mothers, SLC45A2 from their EHG fathers. For 47,000 years, humans lived in Europe and stayed dark. They hunted mammoth. They built Stonehenge. They survived ice ages, but they stayed dark. Then in just 2,000 years, boom, pale skin everywhere. That's not vitamin D, folks. That's what happens when warlords kill your men and breed your women. That's forced selection under elite male replacement. And we can prove it with DNA. Natufians had agriculture for 4,000 years before light skin appeared. Anatolian farmers had agriculture for 2,000 years and stayed medium dark. Even European farmers stayed dark for 3,000 plus years after adopting agriculture. The light skin explosion happens in one specific window, 3,500 to 1,500 BCE, when elite male Y-DNA replacement reaches 80 to 95% in Europe. R1/R1B lineages go from 0% to dominant in centuries. SLC24A5 plus SLC45A2 suddenly get forced selection under elite breeding preferences. Step 2. By 2500 BCE, groups with this steppe ancestry move south into the Biamak zone, modern Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Sarazm. Here they blend with local Iranian farmers, forming the genetic base of Proto-Indo-Iranians. But then something crucial happens. Around 2300 BCE, this population splits. One branch heads east into India, becoming the Aryan invaders who established the caste system. But another branch moves west and southwest, into the Iranian plateau and the Levant. And this is not a mass migration. This is elite male-driven infiltration. The smoking gun, a Canaanite nobleman buried at Tel Megiddo around 1300 BCE, R1B DNA, steppe ancestry, light-skinned, elite burial goods. These incoming elite males carrying R1B, R1A, J1 and J2 lineages, light-skin alleles, and most importantly, the Sredny Stog domination technology, didn't replace the local Semitic populations. They became their ruling class. So when Sargon of Akkad emerges in 2350 BCE, he's not just some local strongman, he's the product of this elite infiltration network. Steppe-derived hierarchical ideology, now implemented through Semitic-speaking populations who've adopted the northern model of systematic control. Although the Yamnaya and Semitic paths diverged early, their elites reconnected many times in history, as Sea Peoples and Reginu coalitions after approximately 1500 BCE, attacking and reshaping the eastern Mediterranean. As Hyksos and Mitanni rulers, blending Indo-European warrior classes with Semitic scribal banker lineages. As Persian, Greek and Roman-era vault families intermarrying and cooperating at the highest levels of empire. In short, two offspring of the same highland ancestry, one born of EHG plus CHG, Yamnaya, the other of Natufian plus CHG, Semitic, became the dual pillars of Eurasian imperial systems. Both carried the mountain genes, the vault strategies, and the drive to dominate, sometimes competing, sometimes colluding, always shaping the fate of empires. By 2500 BC, the Kurgan bloodlines had established themselves in Mesopotamia and created what is the world's first true empire under Sargon of Akkad. Not because they were more powerful than the original Sumer, Egypt, or other countries which had megaliths and written language 1,000 years before Sargon, but because of nomadic invasions and capture of multiple cities and their temples. Sargon's Akkadian era was like we will see again later with the Hyksos in Egypt, a series of horde invasions from the north. The Martu in Sumerian, later known as Amorites, begin to show up as 13 attacking Semitic tribes who lived as wild nomads. The Sumerians built walls to stop their invasions. During this window, Sargon's mythology has him come up a stream in a reed basket. He attains a high position as cupbearer and vizier with no parents, and then seizes the throne. By the time of Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BCE, the blueprint for imperial control was fully formed. Sargon wasn't just another warlord. He was the architect of the system of military, religious, and financial domination that still governs the world today. One of Sargon's most consequential innovations was the institutionalization of the Belu system. In Akkadian, Belu simply means lord, but not just in the sense of a deity. In the temple-state complex of Mesopotamia, Belu was a title. The temple lord, tax baron, or overseer who managed the land, collected tribute, and administered the temple's economic and religious affairs. The same root appears in West Semitic as Baal, meaning master or lord, and in later texts often confused with a personal god rather than a title. Sargon himself referred to himself as Belu, as did the administrators and priests who served under him. Over time, the ruling elite, the temple lords, scribes, and kings, blurred the line between title and divinity. The man who controlled the temple was also treated as a god to his subjects, further sanctifying his power. What modern readers often misunderstand is that names like Baal, Bel, or Bek, encountered in the Bible and elsewhere, were originally titles of office, not personal names of individual gods. They meant the one in charge, much like baron or lord, and only later became personified and mythologized. Judges 2:11, Vaya abdu et habalim, vaya avdu et habaalim, and they served the Baals. Here the verb avad, is used, meaning to serve or to labor for. It is also the root of the noun eved, slave servant. So it's not about worship in the modern abstract sense, but more like serving as a subject serves a king or master, showing loyalty, offering tribute, and performing obligations. What the Hebrew Bible actually says when the Israelites are condemned for avad Baal, serving Baal, or for the eagle, golden calf, the text itself does not describe Baal as a horned devil, a demonic being, or even a fully independent god who fights Yetubiwach. This misunderstanding also extends to the figure of Moloch, or MLK. In Carthage and the Levant, archaeologists have found thousands of urns marked MLK, which some interpret as sacrifices to a god named Moloch. While MLK did mark Tophet sacrifices, MLK also means king in Northwest Semitic, actually meant king, a shortened form of Melech. These sacrificial rituals, including child offerings, were more likely a form of debt repayment or tribute to the ruling elite, an ultimate, horrifying collateral in the temple banking system. In Carthage, the ancient Tophet, sacrificial rituals also reflect this hierarchy of power. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that these sacrifices, called molk, were not only economic or religious in nature, but also social and political. There were at least 3 distinct forms of molk. Molkimorj, a lamb or kid offered as a substitute for a child. Molk Baal, the sacrifice of a Baal, the child of an elite family, a temple lord or landowner. Molk Adam, the sacrifice of an Adam, a child of a commoner. This classification reveals a stark social stratification. The Baalim, the ruling elite, were expected to sacrifice their own children as part of their duty and piety, a kind of tribute to secure their divine and political authority. The children of Adam, the commoners, were also sacrificed, but the term and status were distinct. Greek and Roman sources even report that some Carthaginian nobles, unwilling to offer their own children, would secretly buy or seize the children of the poor as substitutes, but this was seen as a violation of proper ritual. Sargon's system fused these roles. The Belu administered the temple's wealth, managed land leases, and collected taxes. The king claimed divine sanction, often styling himself as a god or son of God. The priests ran the temples as both religious and financial centers. Sargon also centralized weights and measures, created standardized accounting, and monopolized the issuance of loans and grain rations. This was effectively the birth of a centralized temple banking empire. in which religion legitimized financial extraction and debt bondage. This blueprint, the Belu-Baal system, would evolve into regional variations, Belu of grain, Belu of temples, and so on. It institutionalized elite control over food, land, and labor, all sanctified in the name of the gods, but functioning as a brutal hierarchy of power. What David Graeber rightly calls the beginning of slavery, he just had the wrong time for the start in Mesopotamia. He thought it was 3500 BC, but it was later when the culture shifted and the centralized temple economy and standardization across Sumeria happened under Sargon. From that, we would see the trails of conquest, standing armies, debt slavery, oligarchy, and nepotism that would haunt global civilization to this very day. Sargon's very name reveals the pattern. Sharukin/Ken means legitimate king in Akkadian, containing that same Kan phoneme that marks authority across 6,000 years. But more importantly, Sargon created the first systematic fusion of military, financial, and religious power under unified bloodline control. This wasn't the crude domination of earlier warlords. This was sophisticated institutional design. Sargon established the first international taxation system, the first military commercial empire, and the first priest-king fusion that would become the template for every major civilization since. Steppe, an Indo-European influence in the Levant steppe, and Indo-European influence in the Levant. The genetic evidence supports this institutional innovation. After approximately 2500–2000 BCE, waves of populations from the north, with steppe ancestry and R1B and R1A, penetrated the Near East. Groups like the Hurrians, Mitanni, Kassites, and later Indo-Aryan chariot elites brought R1A/R1B with them to Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Levant. The Levant during the Late Bronze Age, approximately 1500–1200 BCE, was full of mixed elites, Hittites, Mitanni, Sea Peoples, Hyksos descendants, etc., many carrying R1B and some R1A. Prior to the rise of the Semitic Akkadians and their empire under Sargon 2350 BC, Sumerian religious life was deeply tied to nature and the fertility of the land, and their gods were perceived as mysterious forces rather than anthropomorphic rulers. In daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, it is explained that early Sumerians worshipped Numina, impersonal powers of rivers, storms, and fertility, which became progressively humanized over time and organized like an aristocracy mirroring human society. 2350 BCE, the Semitic-speaking peoples came to power and Sumerian culture came to an end. The religion persisted but took on a Semitic coloration, with gods increasingly detached from nature and predominantly male, and with Marduk and Ishtar ascending as prominent figures. The author also notes that the gods were anthropomorphized, assigned political and familial roles, and equated with rulers and city-states. This mirrors changes in Indo-European societies, where balanced and often matrilineal traditions were replaced by more patriarchal, hierarchical pantheons aligned with conquering elites. The primitive democracy of city gods meeting at Nippur under An and Enlil also reflects earlier, less centralized conceptions of divine and political authority, which were later overridden by imperial models of kingship and godhood. Under Akkadian and Semitic influence, the Mesopotamian pantheon was restructured. Enlil, already prominent, was elevated further, syncretized with the Semitic god El as the ultimate grantor of kingship, and placed above both Enki and Inanna. This shift reflected the imperial ideology of the Akkadian rulers, who saw kingship as descending from the storm god, aligning divine order with their own military and political dominance. Enki's and Inanna's roles, while still significant, were subordinated to Enlil's patriarchal authority, a pattern strikingly similar to the later dominance of sky father gods in Indo-European societies. Sargon of Akkad revolutionized Sumerian kingship by discarding the older Ensi model where rulers were temple-appointed stewards under divine oversight, and introducing the title Belu, meaning Lord. This marked the birth of centralized divine kingship, where authority no longer stemmed from temple consensus but from personal rule backed by military conquest and divine association. His grandson Naram-Sin radicalized this new theology by deifying himself in his own lifetime, claiming the title God of Akkad, and donning the horned crown of divinity. In doing so, he erased the line between mortal and God, permanently fusing kingship with divinity. This set a precedent for rulers to wield both sacred and political power and blurred the definitions of worship, obedience, and law. Ur-Nammu of Ur inherited this legacy and institutionalized it. He declared himself not only divinely chosen, but divine in function, casting his legal reforms as extensions of sacred will. The king was no longer just Lord, he was law itself. By codifying justice through divine identity, Ur-Nammu laid the groundwork for future rulers to justify earthly control as sacred order. This culminated under Hammurabi, who merged all previous models into a single theology of control. He claimed divine legitimacy from Shamash, the god of justice, and his famous law code established a fully theocratic legal state. For the first time in recorded history, slavery, debt, and economic subjugation were codified not merely as legal conditions, but as reflections of moral order and divine justice. In Hammurabi's framework, to default on debt or violate class status was not just a social failing, it was a sin against divine law. Under Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, whose name itself means divine lawgiver, this control system was codified into the legal framework that still operates today. The famous Code of Hammurabi wasn't just ancient law, it was the operational manual for elite extraction that has never been replaced. 20% interest rates on loans, debt slavery for those who cannot pay, temple ownership of land and resources, taxation flowing upward to support priestly and royal classes, systematic legal discrimination based on social position. Every mechanism in Hammurabi's code operates in your modern banking system, your tax structure, your legal framework. But Hammurabi's code reveals something else crucial: the integration of religious and financial authority. The same temples that controlled religious life also operated as banks, issuing loans, collecting interest, and foreclosing on debtors. Religion and finance weren't separate institutions. They were different aspects of the same control mechanism. This temple banking fusion would prove to be the most durable aspect of the entire system. From Babylonian ziggurats to medieval cathedrals to modern central banks housed in buildings designed like temples, the same bloodlines have used religious architecture and symbolism to legitimize financial extraction for 4,000 years. During this period, a crucial figure appears in the historical record: Abraham, the patriarch of the three major monotheistic religions. Abraham was not a prophet founding a new faith. He was an Amorite operative embedding the Kurgan control system into the power centers of the ancient Middle East. His journey from Ur to Canaan was not spiritual but strategic, moving along established trade and administrative routes, laying down elite networks and ensuring tribute flowed upward. When he arrives in Salem, Jerusalem, Abraham pays a tithe 10% to Melchizedek, the priest-king of El Elyon, God Most High. This is not accidental. It is a recognition of an existing priestly and financial hierarchy to which Abraham aligned himself. Who is El Elyon? El Elyon was not a new or unique god. He was already the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, the father of the gods, long before the biblical writers attempted to merge or overwrite him with Yahweh. His name El, or Il-Al, is attested across the ancient Near East. Ugaritic tablets, Canaanite. El, the wise, father of gods. Akkadian and Amorite names. Il-El appears in personal names. For example, Ishmael means God hears, Israel means struggles with God. Hittite treaties and Syrian city-states also invoked El as their supreme deity. Even Phoenicians and Carthaginians retained the root El in their theonyms. In fact, the El/Il/Al divine name was a shared cultural currency, functioning like a universal brand of legitimacy for priestly and royal authority. So Abraham's tithe is not piety, it's tribute. It acknowledges the existing priestly banking confederation that administered trade, taxes, and temple finances throughout the region. Abraham and his entourage, likely Amorite herders, mercenaries, and scribes, were securing routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt, laying down alliances through marriage, sacrifice, and payment. Later, biblical writers recast this as a spiritual covenant to justify the ethnic narrative. But what the text actually depicts is a classic infiltration and cooperation with the regional elite EL network. When Yahweh enters the scene centuries later, it is as a nationalized, tribalized reinterpretation of this older, shared God El. Even Exodus 6:3 admits, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I was not known to them. Placed sons on trade routes, commanded 320 mercenaries, ran 2 honey trap ops. Son of an idol maker, already part of the temple trade network, tithed to Melchizedek. Negotiated land contracts. Abraham's covenant with his God wasn't a spiritual revelation. It was a contract establishing the terms under which his descendants would serve as intermediaries and extractors for the Kurgan elite. The promise of land flowing with milk and honey wasn't divine blessing. It was payment for services rendered in population control and resource extraction. His Masoretic timeline coincides with regional destruction and foreign invasions into the region, 2100 to 1900 BC. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. The entire Fertile Crescent, from Sumer to Syria to Canaan, experienced widespread disruption from the movement of Amorites and related Levantine groups. First at the Middle Bronze Age collapse 2200 to 2000 BC, and again 1200 BC at the Late Bronze Age collapse. In Masoretic biblical timeline, this aligns near the time of Joshua's 31 town burning missions and the Herem genocide. This was not a uniform collapse, but a period of reorganization and renewal, with Amorite dynasties replacing earlier rulers in many urban centers. Egypt saw growing contact with Asiatic groups, laying the groundwork for later Hyksos dominance. In Mesopotamia and beyond, they encountered complex societies, not empty lands. Here, Steppe power merged with urban bureaucracy and finance, creating a new synthesis. The archaeological record reveals a remarkable confirmation. Between 2000 and 1700 BCE, civilizations from Mesopotamia to Egypt to China built massive new walls to keep invaders and infiltrators out. Egypt's eastern wall, the Amorite-repelling defenses of Ur, and early Chinese frontier ramparts all appear in this narrow window. This wasn't random. It was global pushback against a coordinated mobile elite. And in the same 300-year window, disparate societies, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Europe, all experienced invasions by new light-skinned, chariot-riding elites. From Tocharians in China to Aryans in India to Hyksos in Egypt, Hittites in Anatolia, and R1B charioteers in post-Bel-Beka Europe, the fingerprints of a global domestication system are unmistakable. The Yamnaya, Sintashta Kurgan culture deployments out of Central Europe. Their aggressive expansion, according to Gimbutas, the one who beat geneticists and linguists to the punch on the Kurgan theory, the Kurgan confederation birthed the Hyksos, Kassites, Venetic, Phrygian in Turkey, Balkans and Italy. Their other branches became the Celtic expansion, the Greek colonizers, Roman Empire and subsequent Germanic Slavic expansions. All basically the retinue Egypt wrote about so poorly, the ones who would change their gods, enslave their people, and who would re-record Sumerian mythology and brining slavery to them in the later stages after Sargon the quote-unquote Semite. Although they came from the north where all this other destruction was occurring for the last 500 years, Gimbutas demonstrates. The different tribal units had different languages, but they fell under one main culture, the Kurgan subculture, the Yamnaya. During this period, the goddess-based religions began to fade. Fertility goddesses became victims of rape in myth, reflecting the cultural trauma of patriarchal warlords descending on Bronze Age humanity. Historians call this cultural diffusion. But when warlord priest-kings, debt slavery and mythology shift together, it's no accident. It's a deliberate system. The domestication of humanity. The history books will tell us this was just random independent development. But the evidence tells the story itself. A new population of elite light-skinned warlords and priest-kings, debt slavery, the beginning of large wars and the shift in mythological cosmological beliefs. All coinciding is not coincidence. It's the fingerprints of a global domestication system being installed. This same time period aligns with the Egyptians telling us of the land of retinue, the ancient Egyptian name for the wider Syrian region where the Semitic-speaking Canaanites lived. Egyptians in the 12th dynasty, 1991-1802 BCE, text Story of Sinuhe, where the term Amu is applied about the people of Retjenu. The term Western Asiatic has been used to refer to the people of Retjenu, but can be used to generally refer to the lands now located in modern Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, the Red Sea, and the Caucasus. The laments are rooted in real destruction. Both admonitions of Ipuwer and Curse of Akkad describe real historical events: ecological collapse and famine, invasions by militarized semi-nomadic peoples, murder, enslavement, looting, desecration of sacred spaces, replacement of local elites and loss of cultural autonomy. Modern scholarship has been shaped by European and colonial assumptions, a tendency to see history as a natural progression where invasions and conquests are just part of the cycle of civilizations. A tendency to downplay the suffering of the original peoples because the victor's descendants shaped the narrative. A tendency to valorize the nomads and conquerors as bringing vitality or innovation, echoing 19th, 20th century European colonial rhetoric. This attitude obscures the fact that for the people who endured it, these invasions were experienced as traumatic, destructive, and unjust. When Egyptian and Sumerian texts call the invaders barbarians, chaos bringers, dog-faced, etc., they are expressing a lived experience of profound loss, not just inventing convenient metaphors. The archaeology confirms massive disruptions, abandoned cities, burn layers and destruction levels, evidence of famine and demographic collapse, shifts in material culture and language that correspond to incoming groups, changes in religious pantheons and political systems reflecting the conqueror's dominance. These are not just stories. They are the earliest voices of displaced, defeated civilizations trying to make sense of their dispossession. And they deserve to be heard on their own terms. These invasions were the first great colonial displacements recorded in history. The Akkadians overtaking Sumer, the Gutians ravaging Akkad, the Amorites overrunning southern Mesopotamia, the Hyksos seizing Egypt, the Indo-Europeans sweeping into Anatolia, Greece and India. Each of these left a trail of destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and imposed languages and gods. These weren't just natural migrations. They were acts of conquest and cultural erasure. But the elites had more subtle weapons than chariots and bronze. They perfected the systematic use of sexual compromise for infiltration and control. Historical records document elite women, often of mysterious origin, who became consorts, wives, or advisors to powerful rulers, only to redirect policy toward the interests of external networks. From Abraham selling his wife to foreign kings twice, to his son Isaac's wife fiasco with the same king, the historical recorded accounts of foreign brides in the Egyptian culture in the same age. Later we would see this recurring theme in Esther and Xerxes, to Roxana's influence on Alexander, to the Slavic consorts of Ottoman sultans. These weren't random romantic alliances, but strategic placements designed to capture decision-making processes. Modern intelligence agencies still use honey trap operations because they learned from 4,000 years of elite sexual compromise networks. The pattern repeats. Beautiful, intelligent women of ambiguous background gain access to power centers, then redirect policy through influence or royal line infiltration rather than force. At this time of priestly infiltration by Semites like Sargon in history and Joseph in mythology, and these first infiltration wives, we see the age of the temple banker and priest king rise. And in another coincidence, we see a distinctive genetic marker of powerful priest kings get its start. The Jewish priestly class, the Kohanim, carry that link, and it's embedded in the bloodlines of the bankers and royals through the rest of history, beginning in the time attributed to Abraham. The Cohen modal haplotype, found in Jewish priests worldwide, represents one of the most precisely preserved genetic lineages in human history. JP158, as genetics can tell us, doesn't rise from one man, but from a handful of priest kings in this time window. This precision isn't accidental. It represents 6,000 years of careful endogamy, designed to preserve specific bloodline characteristics that enable elite coordination across vast distances and long time periods. Where is it most abundant today? Along the same path of the early Retgenu area, the AMU lands Palestine to Iran and the Caucasus, where it all began, with the spread of the Indo-European language and the replacement of male lines and culture, all along their path. This isn't a direct attack on any Halpa groups in general. As science has proven, environment plays the main factor into who we become, more than anything else. But this is first and foremost the legacy of an ideology of conquest, of colonization and hierarchical rule. In the trail of the elite leaders who have manipulated and domesticated even their own populations, we can see who has held the stash, who locks the vault, who resets society at their whim. To find a solution, first you need to know the problem, the whole problem. In this exercise, we are going to show you the root of the poison tree. Trivial agreements like capitalism versus communism, Christianity versus Islam, left versus right, all get replaced by a simple cliché. Follow the money. Because when nations fall and the temple bankers stand, then you can bet they had a helping hand. The bankers plot and change regime, while the masses vote, wish and dream. Between 17 and 1350 BC, the same Kurgan Semitic bloodlines that controlled Mesopotamia infiltrated and captured control of Egypt through the mysterious Hyksos dynasties. But the Hyksos weren't just foreign invaders from unknown lands. They were the same elite networks implementing their control system in a new territorial base. Pharaoh Khian, one of the most powerful Hyksos rulers, carries the Khan phoneme in his very name. But more importantly, recent DNA analysis of royal Egyptian mummies, including Tutankhamun, reveals R1B genetic markers, the same Kurgan bloodlines found across Europe and Mesopotamia. The Hyksos J1/J2 lineages for the first time, breaking 2,000 years of native rule Egypt would be foreign rulers, invaders and enslavers, and they named them as such, rulers of foreign lands. This genetic evidence proves what historians have long suspected but couldn't demonstrate. The ruling elite of ancient Egypt were indigenous Africans. Nilotic features with tropical bodies, the original Egyptian dynasties came from the south of Egypt near Sudan with a more sub-Saharan African appearance. Their constant fight with Asiatic invaders, their images in reliefs of pale nomads and invaders in the Asiatics. While Semitic and Eurocentric historians downplay the Hyksos as propaganda, we see real documented damage in southern Egypt during the Hyksos era, confirmed by archaeology and their own records, which is unusual for a civilization that rarely admitted defeat. The mummy DNA shows increased foreign ancestry, the royal titles reflect foreign kingship, and the introduction of Hittite-style chariots into Egypt's military confirms the reality of this period as a true conquest, not just immigration. The first shift from kings to pharaoh occurs at this time as well. The Habiru, like Hebrew, Hyksos, and Amu, like Amorites, consistently show light pale skin, a clear minority in a time where Europe itself had just been a majority dark-skinned population. When Egyptian reliefs say that foreign invaders occupy and enslave them multiple times in the 2000 BC to 1400 BC period, Eurocentric and Arabic historians dismiss this as hyperbole, but the DNA and archaeological record shows a clear coinciding of foreign invasions from the north and east in Iran/West Asia for the entire region. Meanwhile, while historians continue to ignore the pigmentation and spread of J1 timing in the region, along with R1B found in Egypt and Canaanite noblemen during this period, they also focus on the difference between dark Nubian imagery drawn by Egyptians and reddish-brown for themselves. History shows that's an exercise in futility, since the Nubians painted themselves red as well. And Egyptians also have several reliefs that show themselves as dark as Nubians and Nubians as light as themselves. Both cultures show a start in Tesseti 3900 BC, far before any Semites entered the Levant or Africa, and before light-skinned alleles were even more than a mere sprinkle in the world's overall populations anywhere. The UNESCO flooding and the constant invasions by the northern Asiatics into Egypt and eventually Nubia led to much of the later fighting we see. And while later historians would say Hyksos and Nubians fought Egypt, they don't clarify that there was no union. They were both in a battle from different locations with different motives. It was after chaotic times regionally that Nubia would be invaded and re-invade Egypt. And that's not even mentioning the constant competing and divided kingships in both their empires, and the blurred lines of which specific Nubians or possible newer Ethiopian Semitic hybrid Sabaean had mixed. Nomads were moving through the region, but they shared the same hieroglyphs, the same royal tombs and the same gods, before the Amu inserted new attributes into the native Egyptian pantheon. The old kingdoms were made up of the same genetic profiles, and the loss of the shared Egyptian-Nubian area to UNESCO's 1967 Floods and Dam Project hide much of the Meroitic script and potential shared kinship in Old Kingdom Egypt. One thing we know for sure is Nubia shared maternal lines with Egypt, the same mother-helper groups, and in Africa the mother's clan take priority, so the Egyptians would have always felt more kinship with the south than with the northern invaders. Perhaps even more telling of whom were the true Egyptians versus the foreign rulers is the fact that Egypt and Nubia are the only two nations in history to build flat-side pyramids. Nubia actually has more pyramids and finished in 300 AD with their last. Flourishing until their Semitic neighbor Ethiopia, then under Christian Byzantine influence from Frumentius, a Phoenician Semitic envoy, attacked Nubia and ended their 700 years of native Meroitic script and pyramid construction. Nubia also had the first royal tomb. Their use of the royal white falcon motif in the Quetzal incense predates Egypt's, and they saved Egypt from enslavement on separate occasions, while not defiling Egypt's temples but restoring them and their religion. But by the 17th century BC, the same Kurgan Semitic hybrid populations that captured Sumer, the 13 Semitic tribes that invaded Lugalan Mundus Sumer, the hordes of Akkadians and Semitic nomads, used confederations of Semite and Kurgan elites to consistently invade the north of Egypt, mirroring the north and south dynamics of Sumer centuries earlier. From 1650 to 1550 BC, Egypt would have competing rulers in the north, invaders. Semitic named pharaohs who stole hieroglyphs and turned them into Proto-Sinai-TC script, which led to Phoenician alphabets and eventually to all alphabets after the Bronze Age collapse. In the invaders' second stretch as rulers with R1B European helper groups from 1401 to 1320 BC, there are Mitanni wives and rumors of different fathers. Thutmose IV, who ruled Egypt from 1401 to 1391 BCE, was not supposed to be king according to any traditional measure of Egyptian royal succession. Elder brothers Prince Amenemheb and Prince Sise mysteriously vanish from all records. Their reliefs show deliberate defacement and erasure. The dream stele at Giza represents divine justification for illegitimate rise. The inscription claims the Sphinx promised him the throne in a dream, classic propaganda for contested succession. Mother Mutimwea never titled Great Royal Wife during Thutmose III's reign. Her name contains Wea element matching Hurrian Mitanni patterns, not Egyptian nomenclature. She appears in records only after her son's accession. Chronological timing suggests posthumous birth or foreign impregnation during Thutmose III's Levantine campaigns. Betsy Bryan. Mutimwea appears only after son's accession, royal status derived from his power, not legitimate marriage. Nicholas Reeves calls her a northern queen of non-Theban origin, explicit scholarly recognition of foreign background. N. Nielsen policy shifts not accidental but tied to new priorities favoring northern kingdoms over Egyptian interests. Romney, he could not establish legitimate succession, assessment of fundamental dynastic instability. Dream stele, universally recognized as admission of contested legitimacy. No legitimate pharaoh needs divine justification propaganda. Amenhotep III marries Gilukipa, Tushratta's sister. Unprecedented elevation of foreign princess to Egyptian queen status. Later marries Tadukipa, Tushratta's daughter. Father and daughter both hold Egyptian court authority. Systematic foreign influence in royal court. Egyptian treasure flows north to Mitanni while empire weakens. El hints through Ptah syncretism under Amenhotep II introduces Levantine theology into Egyptian religious practice. In the first foreigner king, Hyksos invasion, they would put Baal in the temple of Set and made it Seth, a common syncretism practice for Semitic infiltrators of the temples during the Bronze Age. Sargon and then the Amorites, Hurrians before and after Sargon's Akkadian Semite elite, did the same in Sumer. All this time period change, coupled with the dying of the older languages, creates a muddying of time period authority, separation of pantheons and deities between pre- and post-Steppe epochs, and the defining principles of these temples forever. The Hyksos, in and in the chaos of the R1B kings, 1470 to 1320 BC, the Kurgan confederation would insert the sun worship like with Shemesh and Simij, but through Aten cults. His father, Thutmose IV, first started to mention it, the first 1 billion reals, pharaoh of 3. Then by the time of Amen III, it is an official cult of the sun, setting up the way for Akhenaten. Under Akhenaten, the last influential pharaoh of these bloodlines, they perfected one of their most important innovations. monotheistic religion as a tool for centralized control. The El Amarna revolution in monotheism under Khan of Aten or Akhenaten wasn't religious reform, it was the beta test for the control system that would later be deployed as Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Akhenaten's worship of Aten represented the same principle that would govern all subsequent monotheistic religions. One god means one priesthood means centralized authority controlled by specific bloodlines. Polytheistic systems allow for competing power centers and regional autonomy. Monotheism concentrates all religious authority in a single hierarchical institution. Akhenaten effectively did the same thing to Egypt that Sargon did to Sumer, put all the temple funds in one pot, and claim authority over that himself. The El in El Amarna is a call to the El god of Canaan and the Semitic Hurrian axis of Bul El Teshub worship. That his father tried to put El features under Puta in the pantheon is another tell of their foreign corruption. Even more revealing is the content from the Amarna letter EA24. In it, Mitanni Hurrian kings are asking for gold from Akhenaten, who was hoarding temple tribute under his Aten system. And Akhenaten got several letters like that from regional enemies of both his ancestors and successors, the Retyenu. Akhenaten was draining Egypt while being called brother by his Mitanni allies, betraying the crown and showing illegitimacy. EA letters document several things. EA24, the longest surviving Hurrian text, provides the smoking gun. Tushratta writes to Amenhotep III in pure Hurrian, proving the institutional language of the elite networks remained Hurrian even after territorial kingdoms fell. EA letters document treasure flowing to foreign allies while native Egyptian interests collapse. Systematic wealth transfer northward to Mitanni coordinates through Hurrian diplomatic networks. Native Egyptian interests subordinated to Levantine relationships. Traditional allies abandoned for Mitanni coordination. Classic pattern of infiltrated elites serving foreign networks. Royal policy serves external rather than domestic interests. Economic extraction disguised as religious revolution. Monotheistic reform masks systematic wealth redistribution. Amarna letters show preferential treatment of northern allies over Egyptian vassals and traditional power centers. Ankhesenamun letter to Suppiluliuma proves foreign allegiance. Akhenaten's widow writes, "My husband has died and I have no son. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. Give me one of your sons to become my husband and king of Egypt." Foreign queen refuses to marry Egyptian, explicitly rejects native Egyptian candidates, demands Hittite prince for Egyptian throne. Zananza murdered en route by hostile Egyptians. Hittite prince killed before reaching Egypt, native resistance to foreign takeover. Akhenaten retreats to northern Levant when monotheistic system fails. Self-exile to same region Egypt, documented invasions from. Shows coordination with northern Asiatic networks documented in Egyptian records. Strategic retreat to allied territory when native resistance proves overwhelming. The worst of these three R1B kings, Akhenaten, was hated most by all Egyptians, had his temple destroyed and lived in the north far away from Thebes, where they disapproved of his changing of the temple system, was omitted from several kings' lists, just like Hyksos pharaohs. So like Hyksos, we see Semitic Caucasus syncretism, foreign DNA markers, debt manipulation. Let's review the facts. R1B DNA sequence, Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, puppet child king. Eurasian paternal lineage absent in pre-18 the dynasty. Complete break from native E1B1/E1B1B1/M78 Egyptian baseline. Foreign genetic intrusion at highest level of power. Elongated skulls appear only on R1B pharaohs. Visual elite marker absent in native Egyptian rulers. Higher Neanderthal admixture in R1B lineages. Genetic signature of northern steppe ancestry in Egyptian royal house. The genetic evidence from this period is particularly revealing. The royal mummies from the Amarna period show elongated skulls and distinctive genetic markers that appear nowhere else in the Egyptian population. Only Tut R1B and Akhenaten R1B have elongated skulls as pharaohs. Recent genomic work reveals that elongated skulls were not merely cultural styling but reflected genuine biological differences, maintained through deliberate selective breeding and endogamy. Elite lineages carried higher Neanderthal admixture, particularly R1B and R1 of paternal lines, with genes like RUNX2 and GLI3 influencing cranial development. Elongation signaled vault access, literally and metaphorically, preserving an ancient phenotype tied to authority and ritual. Ancient myths of the Nephilim, sons of the gods who took the daughters of humans, may preserve a memory of elite overrights by visibly distinct rulers. Archaeological evidence shows that cranial elongation was deliberately practiced among many elite groups, likely as a status symbol signaling their elevated or divine position. These practices, along with legends of tall stature, unusual features, and ritualized appearances, helped mark ruling elites as set apart from the common population, reinforcing their authority and mythic status. These physical characteristics would later appear in elite bloodlines across Europe and Asia, suggesting systematic breeding programs designed to preserve specific genetic traits, from Gotland queens to steppe maternal DNA and red-haired elongated skull Paracas. While King Tut possibly had red hair passed through genetics, Rameses has red hair through henna dye. The Ramesside lines, all 13 pharaohs, are now shown to be E1B1A or sub-Saharan and Central African DNA. Y-DNA from Ramesses III confirms it, and all of the Ramesside lines through 11 are related paternally. The conventional history suggests Egypt, who was traditionally isolationist, up and decided to invade Canaan and fight Israel. But when you take into account the enslavement and destruction caused by the Hyksos, the invasions for the next 400 years make sense. The North had done damage to Egypt on 3 different occasions: the Dark Age invasions 2100 BC, the Hyksos era 1650 BC, and Akhenaten's temple scheming in 1350 BC, from which he would go into self-exile in North. The same place Egypt had been documenting invasions and trying to repel them in multiple eras, closer to Israel and the Asiatics. The biblical story of Joseph in Egypt describes exactly how this economic control system operated, and legends of the Jews, the highly regarded work of rabbinic and midrashic texts, even states how Joseph enslaved Egypt. Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams and his management of the 7-year famine wasn't divine inspiration. It was sophisticated economic warfare using food as a weapon. By storing grain during abundant years and selling it at inflated prices during scarce years, Joseph's administration impoverished the entire Egyptian population and concentrated all land ownership in royal hands. This debt foreclosure system would become the standard method for elite land acquisition for the next 4,000 years. The interest, 1/5 or 20%, the same number we will see throughout our series across seemingly disparate cultures. But Joseph wasn't working alone. Archaeological evidence suggests that the economic policies implemented during this period were coordinated with similar operations throughout the ancient Middle East, indicating a level of international coordination that historians have never adequately explained. The correspondence between Amorite and Hyksos makes it definitive. This was a regional transnational cartel with predatory debt slavery practices. From Semitic tribes to Akkadian Sargon and his Semitic reign, Amorites were Semites, Hyksos Semites, Phoenicians after them, Semites, Canaanites during all their time in the region with their Baal debt worship and tax farming system. Semites. The southern vector of the Yamnaya brought a constant horde of charioteers, enslavers, and temple overwriters with new genes replacing the male lines regionally. The same thing we would see in Asia, Europe, Africa, and later in Mesoamerica. The answer lies in the bloodline networks. The same families that controlled economic policy in Egypt also controlled trade networks, military operations, and religious institutions across the region. What appears to be separate civilizations competing for resources was actually a single network extracting wealth from multiple territorial bases. In Jewish texts, Abraham has 8 sons. They all coincidentally moved to important trade routes. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the entire system of Bronze Age civilizations collapsed within a span of 50 years. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece was destroyed. The Egyptian New Kingdom ended. Trade networks that had operated for centuries simply stopped functioning. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse and attribute it to climate change, natural disasters, or invasions by mysterious sea peoples. When you examine the genetic and institutional evidence, a different picture emerges. This collapse was not merely random, but exploited by opportunistic groups, some of whom were likely displaced elites or their military retainers. The Sea Peoples were not a single coordinated ethnic group, but rather a confederation of populations, possibly including elements of the same steppe and Semitic networks, who adapted to changed circumstances by turning to maritime raiding and settlement, carrying elite strategies into new territories. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that during this period, the same elite bloodlines simultaneously established control nodes throughout the known world. In South Arabia, they became the Sabaean kingdoms controlling the incense trade. In Ethiopia, they established the Aksumite Empire, controlling Red Sea commerce. In North Africa, they became the Libyan dynasties that would rule Egypt for the next several centuries. In Ramesses Year 8, the Nine Bows appear as a conspiracy in their isles. This time, they are revealed unquestionably as sea peoples, the Peliset, Yeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, which are classified as foreign countries in the inscription. They camped in Amur and sent a fleet to the Nile. While Egyptians never explicitly link the Libyans and the Sea Peoples, their timing, features, and organization are consistent with being two offshoots of the same larger Indo-European/Yamnaya expansion that had already transformed Europe and the Near East. And Libya would later be home to the Phoenician port cities. Genetic and archaeological evidence confirms the Meshwesh were not indigenous North Africans. Their light skin, steppe-like features, and presence in Egyptian reliefs align them more with the Levantine and Aegean elites of the Sea Peoples than with the Maghrebi populations of the Sahara. At a time when even Europe was still largely dark-skinned, the Meshwesh stand out as an imported warrior elite, a desert flank of the same networks that brought down the Bronze Age world. After defeating the Sea Peoples in one of Egypt's last great victories, Ramesses III recorded his triumph at Medinet Habu. "I trapped them like wild fowl. The flame was before them and a wall of metal behind. They were overturned and dragged onto the shore, slaughtered and heaped in piles from stern to bow of their ships." The Sea Peoples came at Egypt on two fronts. One army swept down through Canaan by land, while another invaded the delta by sea. Ramesses III outmaneuvered them with a naval ambush, annihilating their fleet and ending their threat, at least temporarily. But the inscriptions also note something sobering. While Egypt won, many of the defeated invaders, including the pale-skinned, sharp-featured Meshwesh, Libyans, were not destroyed but scattered and resettled in Egypt and Canaan. The Meshwesh, often depicted like the Asiatic Hyksos, light-skinned, long-nosed, with tattoos and feathers, bore no resemblance to earlier North Africans and more closely matched northern steppe and Levantine types. Ramesses III's triumph was short-lived. Only a few years later, he himself was assassinated in the infamous Harem conspiracy led by a foreign wife who sought to place her own son on the throne. The aging pharaoh's throat was slit, and Egypt's decline accelerated. Over the next century, his sons and grandsons reigned but grew weaker, as Egypt faced more Meshwesh and Libyan invasions. The Libyans, once prisoners and raiders, eventually settled, infiltrated the delta, and took the throne themselves, enslaving Egyptians much like the Hyksos, Persians, Greeks, and Romans would after them. The Libyan dynasties, like their predecessors, came from the north, drawing on the same mythological and financial traditions propagated by the scribes of the Phoenician Hebrew nexus. This recurring pattern of northern invaders, steppe, Asiatic, Libyan, Phoenician, installing themselves through war, banking, and priestly networks, reveals the continuity of elite domination long after the Sea Peoples faded from the records, but most importantly, they established two operational branches that would define the next 3,000 years of human history. The land-based branch centered in Palestine and became the Hebrew priesthood. The maritime branch centered in Lebanon and became the Phoenician trading empire. Both branches maintained the same genetic markers, the same institutional templates, and the same phonemic signatures and reached the height of their power in the same windows. Both preserved the Khan phoneme as Cohen in Hebrew priestly families and as Khan Baal in Phoenician religious titles. Both operated the same triumvirate system of military force, financial extraction, and religious control. But they appeared to be separate and often competing civilizations, providing perfect cover for coordinated operations across vast distances. In the power vacuum that followed, the Hebrews and the Phoenicians represented the masterstroke of the elite strategy, a dual-pronged approach to control. On one hand, the Hebrews consolidated in the inland hill country as a land-based, priestly legal confederation. On the other, the Phoenicians re-established a vast maritime trading empire from their ancient Canaanite coastal cities. While they appeared different, one tribal and religious, the other commercial and seafaring, they were in fact two sides of the same coin, operated and managed by overlapping elite families. Before the Hebrews emerged as a distinct priestly and mercantile caste, the Phoenicians were already the Levant's master scribes, meticulous traders and temple merchants. They referred to themselves simply as Kena'ani, merchants, the same word later rendered as Canaanites in Hebrew. They developed and spread the first true alphabet, which the Hebrews adopted and adapted into their own script centuries later. The loss of most Phoenician records written on perishable papyrus hides the fact that it was they, not the Hebrews, who first recorded contracts, navigational knowledge, and temple rites in systematic written form. The Phoenicians also carried with them betel stones, meteorites or sacred stones, worshipped in their sanctuaries. These stones appear again in the Greek omphalos, the Roman palladium, the Kaaba in Mecca, and Kabbalistic traditions, all variations of the same ancient cult of fallen stones. Even their mythology anticipates later Hebrew and Christian themes. Stories of El and his son who is bound and offered in sacrifice echo the Abraham-Isaac binding and prefigure the crucifixion of Jesus by many centuries. The Phoenicians transmitted this mythos westward into Rome and Greece, building temples, installing priestly networks, and teaching the economic and religious techniques that would underpin Mediterranean civilization. The Hebrews, as a subset or offshoot of these Canaanite Phoenician networks, inherited their script, their temple architecture, their merchant traditions, and their sky father theology, rebranding the Phoenician merchant scribe model into the Yahwist priest scribe ideal. In short, the Phoenicians were not only the scribes of their own empire, but also the silent architects of the Hebrew, Greek, and Roman religious and commercial orders that followed. The Phoenician scribes were not only merchants of goods, they were merchants of names, myths, and numbers. Their chief god was El, known as the father of gods and humans. The Hebrews inherited this directly. Their earliest texts still speak of El Elyon, God Most High, before gradually replacing El with Yahweh. In fact, throughout the oldest strata of Hebrew scripture, El and Yahweh are used interchangeably. And even modern Christian liturgy still invokes El. Consider names like Elohim or Emmanuel, God with us, and the continued use of El in titles like El Shaddai. But the Phoenician story of El went further. They told of El offering his son, Idud, similar to Iesus for Jesus, reconstructed from Ugaritic as beloved or only one, in a sacrifice to atone for human failing, like Jesus as well. This is attested in texts from Ugarit, close kin of Phoenician culture, where El's son dies and is mourned by the gods, only to return, a clear precursor to the later Hebrew and Christian stories of Isaac and Jesus. The genealogy of the gods recorded by Sanchuniathon can be seen in the table shown. A Phoenician priest said to have written before the Trojan War preserves the theology of the late Bronze Age Canaanite Phoenician world as practiced around 1200 BCE. Although the surviving text reaches us only through Greek translation centuries later, the names and roles of the gods, El, Baalat, Mot, Astarte, Hadad, align closely with deities attested in contemporary Ugaritic and Phoenician inscriptions. This divine family tree reflects a spiritual framework already embedded in the cultures that shaped both Hebrew and Greek mythologies. Even though most Phoenician papyri have dissolved and we rely mainly on stone inscriptions, Greek translations like Sanchuniathon, and parallels from Ugarit and the Bible, the whole family of Semitic peoples, Phoenicians, Canaanites, Ugaritians, Hebrews, Amorites, and even Arameans, shared the same basic pantheon and religious vocabulary. Whether written in stolen adapted cuneiform, Ugarit, Akkad, Babylon, or in Proto-Sinaitic/Phoenician alphabet, the names and roles of the gods were remarkably consistent. El, the supreme father god; Baal, Hadad, storm and fertility god, lord; Asherah or Baalat, mother goddess, lady of Byblos; Mot, death; Yam, sea, chaos; Shapash, sun goddess. They differed in language, spelling, and emphasis, but the myths, sacrifices, and divine family trees overlapped strongly. So even though the Phoenician written record is fragmentary today, due to fragile materials like papyrus and parchment, their gods and myths are mirrored in the better preserved Ugaritic cuneiform tablets, Hebrew Bible verses, and later Greek accounts, proving that the confederation of Semites shared a common mythic and religious system regardless of script. And if there were still any doubt about how deeply these gods bound the ancient world together, consider this. Among the 40,000+ clay tablets excavated at the Hittite capital Hattusa, written in cuneiform, we even find Baal and El invoked in treaties, hymns, and ritual texts. The Hittites, Indo-European-speaking rulers of Anatolia, Turkey, adopted and honored these Semitic deities alongside their own. This shows that the worship of El and Baal was not just a local Canaanite or Phoenician practice, but a pan-Mediterranean and Near Eastern reality. These gods transcended language, script, and empire, carved in cuneiform, inscribed in the Phoenician alphabet, remembered in stone, whispered in papyrus. Even the mighty Hittites, who once overran Babylon and challenged Egypt at Kadesh, paid homage to them. That is how far and wide their power and memory stretched. Like the Hyksos before them, the Hittites used chariots, the compound bow, and sophisticated diplomacy to carve out their empire. They referred to Semitic kings as brothers in their diplomatic letters, acknowledging a shared sacred and political order. The Hittites were themselves relatively recent migrants into Anatolia, having absorbed Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform writing from Mesopotamia, much as the Phoenicians adapted Proto-Sinaitic alphabetic script from Egyptian hieroglyphs. What we see here is one confederation of cultures, Indo-European and Semitic, whose elites intermarried, traded, fought, and shared gods, words, and technologies. Linguists later classified Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic/Semitic as completely separate language families, but culturally, politically, and even linguistically they were intertwined. Evident in shared vocabulary, especially in chariotry, horses, metallurgy, and royal titles. Shared military innovations and shared temple economies that stretched from Anatolia to Canaan, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond into India, Iran, and even early China. When we speak of El and his worshippers in the Late Bronze Age, we're not just talking about abstract myth. We're looking at real people moving across the Levant and Egypt, leaving traces in texts, stones, and even their DNA. The Shasu, light-skinned, Semitic-speaking pastoralists, appear in Egyptian inscriptions from as early as the reign of Thutmose II, around 1500 BCE. They range from the Jezreel Valley to Ashkelon, through the Transjordan and Sinai. In the reliefs of Ramesses III, captured Shasu are depicted clearly as light-skinned Semites, not Africans, consistent with Levantine populations of the time. Long before the name Yahweh appeared in Hebrew scripture, around the 6th century BCE, Egyptian records mention a deity called Yu of the Shasu, attested in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, worshipped in the same regions the Shasu inhabited. The Shasu thus brought the name Yu Yahweh into the historical record centuries before it was written in Hebrew, suggesting that early Levites or Hebrews inherited this god from their Shasu and Canaanite forebears. Shasu of Yu in Egyptian texts c. 1400–1200 BCE places Yahweh in Edom, Midian, before Israelite state Moses in Midian Exodus. Narrative set ~13 the C. BCE suggests Yahweh worship came from southern deserts, Levites as mediators. Levites brought Yahweh cult into Israel from Midian. In the 13th century BCE, copies of the column inscriptions ordered by Seti I or by Ramesses II at Amara, Nubia, 6 groups of Shasu are mentioned, those of Ser, of Arbien, of Smat, of Eber, of Yitabu, and of Pisps. The Shasu continued to dominate the hill country of Canaan, Cisjordan, and Transjordan regions. In the year 39 of Thutmose III, during his 14th campaign, the pharaoh fought the Shasu before reaching the Ret Jenu. Shasu are therefore found in southern Canaan. According to the pharaoh's list, they are more specifically located in the Negev, number 14 of the list. Abraham lived for a while in the Negev after being banished from Egypt, Genesis 13:1-3. During the Exodus journey to the Promised Land, Moses sent 12 scouts into the Negev to assess the land and population, Numbers 13:17. Later, the northern part of biblical Negev was inhabited by the tribe of Judah, and the southern part of biblical Negev by the tribe of Simeon. The Negev was later part of the Kingdom of Solomon in its entirety all the way to the Red Sea, And then, with varied extension to the south, part of the kingdom of Judah at the same time, we have genetic evidence of a Canaanite nobleman buried at Tel Megiddo, Jezreel Valley, ca 1300 BCE, carrying R1B DNA, the same haplogroup later seen in some Egyptian elite mummies from the Amarna period. This nobleman was buried with an elite funerary assemblage in a place called El Shaddad in the Jezreel Valley, invoking the same god title, El Shaddai, God Almighty, known from Hebrew tradition. Studies in recent years have also shown sporadic Bronze Age era R1Y DNA factors sporadically throughout elite burials, further suggesting that the light-skinned populations the Egyptians depicted were likely accurate, and that the Canaanites were a loose band of different genetic markers. Like Yamnaya and other early Kurgan confederation members, Gimbuta's timing shows the Transcaucasian migrations moving in the same time window. Together, the Shasu, Hyksos, Habiru, a term used in Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts for bands of marginalized Semitic peoples, Amu, another Egyptian term for Levantines and remnants of their Kurgan ally Sea peoples, formed the population we later recognize as early Hebrews, a blend of nomads, mercenaries, and settled Canaanites who carried their gods, including El and Yahweh, into Israelite religion. When Christianity emerged, the name of its central figure, Yehoshua, later rendered as Jesus and Jesus, carried profound meaning. YW saves. Intriguingly, it also resonates phonetically and thematically with older Northwest Semitic names like Yadid, beloved, and with the widespread motif of a beloved son given or sacrificed, a story already told in Phoenician and Canaanite religion. Millennia before the Christian Gospels, the Phoenicians had dispersed this myth of the beloved or sacrificed son westward into Greece and Rome, embedding it in temple rites and inscribed on stones and papyri, fragments of which still survive. Yehoshua, later shortened to Yeshua, is the original Hebrew name underlying Jesus, Greek Jesus, Latin Jesus, English Jesus. The continuity of the name and the myth reflects a shared cultural memory, from El, the father god of Canaanite and Phoenician law, mourning a dying son, to Yhwh, sparing Isaac, to the Christian father giving his son. The Phoenician scribes, through their alphabets, trade routes, and temple economy, were the silent transmitters of these stories. They didn't just invent letters, they transmitted the myths that powered civilizations. Christians still unknowingly invoke this continuity today, praying to El Elyon through a son whose name and narrative echo the archetype of the beloved, sacrificed son, a pattern already present thousands of years earlier in the mythology of El and his divine council. In Carthage and Phoenician colonies, the Tophet, an open-air ritual site, was used to burn infants and young children as offerings to Baal Hammon and Tanit in hopes of securing rain, crops, and the favor of the gods. These sacrifices were not chaotic savagery, but highly organized, recorded in inscriptions, and even institutionalized into civic life. This brutal reality was later encoded into myth. The idea of a virgin sacrifice, or a beloved son, given for the good of the land, evolved into more metaphorical rituals and narratives. From Isaac's near sacrifice on Mount Moriah to Jesus' crucifixion. The archetype of sacrificing the innocent to renew the earth became a sophisticated theological metaphor, yet its agricultural origins, killed to ensure the harvest, were never forgotten. The Phoenicians, as scribes and mythmakers, didn't just conduct these rites. They codified them into their alphabets and temples, passing on a polished version of the ancient "we must give a virgin for the crops" scheme, wrapped in the language of divine destiny and moral obligation. The Hebrew network perfected the ideological and legal pillar of the triumvirate. The narrative of Exodus and conquest served as a founding myth, uniting tribes under a single god and priesthood. The Levitical priestly class functioned as administrators, jurists, and temple bankers. Their legal code, the Torah, was a governance operating system, embedding contracts, tithes, debt laws, and land tenure rules, consolidating control in the priestly elite. This codification did not happen in isolation. The Bible itself was compiled in the courts of Persia and libraries of Babylon, long after the events it purports to describe. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel were scribes embedded in imperial administration, bringing Babylonian and Persian fiscal administrative knowledge into Hebrew law. The temple became the central data center of a theocratic economy, religion as record-keeping and population management. Simultaneously, the Phoenician network mastered the financial and military maritime pillar. From Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they built a decentralized commercial empire. Their temples operated as banks and trading houses, financing long-distance voyages and underwriting risk, while their merchant princes controlled strategic ports from the Levant to Spain. The alliance between King Solomon of Israel and King Hiram of Tyre, building the Jerusalem temple together and conducting joint expeditions, exemplifies this partnership. Together, these two branches, the Hebrew land-based confederation and the Phoenician maritime empire, formed a complementary system, one temple-bound, the other port-bound. Both preserved the ancient Khan-Khn phoneme of authority, Cohen among the Hebrews, Baal-Khn among the Phoenicians, as markers of their role in the ancient vault system. The timing after the Sea People invasions and a millennia of West Asiatic, Semitic and steppe-derived invasions, infiltrations and slavery is too much to be coincidence. Timeline: Phoenicians and Hebrews side by side, approximately 1200 BCE, Bronze Age collapse. Egypt and Hittites weaken, opening space for both Hebrews and Phoenicians to rise. Approximately 1050 BCE, Saul becomes the first king of Israel, the Hebrew monarchy begins. Approximately 1000 BCE, King David consolidates Israel, Jerusalem becomes capital. Approximately 970–931 BCE, King Solomon rules. Israel reaches its greatest territorial and economic power. During Solomon's reign, approximately 950 BCE, the Hebrews and Phoenicians cooperate closely. Notably, King Hiram of Tyre supplies cedar and craftsmen for Solomon's temple, documented in 1 Kings 5. After Solomon, Israel splits into northern Israel and southern Judah kingdoms, but the Phoenicians continue expanding westward. Approximately 900–700 BCE, Phoenicians establish colonies across the western Mediterranean, Carthage, 814 BCE, Tripolitania, Spain. This synergy proved so effective that it became a template for all subsequent empires, combining administrative orthodoxy with mobile capital networks, embedding religious and commercial authority in hereditary elites, and maintaining control through legal, financial, and ideological means. They weren't rivals, they were modular installations of the same vault logic. Simultaneously, the maritime branch established the first global trading empire in human history. The Phoenicians weren't just merchants, they were sophisticated bankers, military organizers, and colonial administrators operating a network that spanned from Spain to India. But the Phoenician Empire has been systematically erased from historical consciousness because it reveals too much about how elite networks actually operate. Unlike territorial empires with visible borders and capitals, the Phoenician system operated through commercial networks, financial relationships, and colonial trading posts. This was the prototype for every subsequent form of corporate colonialism, from the medieval Italian city-states to the Dutch and British East India companies, to modern multinational corporations. The same bloodlines, the same methods, the same institutional templates evolved and adapted but never fundamentally changed. Carthage's general population was not made up of Levantine Phoenicians, but rather a local mix of North African, Aegean, and Sicilian ancestry, with the Phoenician elite acting as a colonial administrative and religious layer. The famous Birsa boy, a young elite male buried in Carthage, was found to carry R1B paternal DNA, suggesting his ancestry was more consistent with European or steppe-influenced lineages than with Levantine Semitic lines. This supports the idea that Phoenician colonial elites established vault-style control and ritual practices without mass Levantine settlement, functioning much like the later Venetian or Dutch trading elites. The practice of child sacrifice to Saturn/Kronos/Baal was widespread across Mediterranean cultures, not exclusive to the Phoenicians. Archaeology and literary sources confirm that the ritual killing of children or firstborns as offerings to divine rulers, for example, Saturn in Rome, Kronos in Greece, Baal-Hamon in Carthage, reflected a shared Near Eastern elite cult. The Phoenicians institutionalized and exported it through their colonies, embedding it within the ruling elite's ideology rather than the general populace. This points to a vault tradition shared by elites across cultures rather than a uniquely Phoenician phenomenon. To review continuity. When the Hebrews leave Egypt, if we take Exodus as reflecting some historical memory, they almost immediately fall into worship of a golden calf, bull, at Sinai, Exodus 32. This calf is not random. It is clearly linked to the bull symbol of El Baal that was worshipped throughout Canaan. In fact, at Jeroboam's schism, 1 Kings 12, he also sets up golden calves at Bethel and Dan, clearly identifying Yahweh with the old Baal bull imagery. In the time of Jeremiah, 7th-6th C BCE, Jeremiah, Espositus chapters 2, 7, 19, 32, rages against the Hebrews, worshipping Baal and making offerings to the Queen of Heaven, likely Asherah Ishtar. He even says, "They have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as offerings to Baal," Jeremiah 19:5. So even at the eve of the Babylonian exile, approximately 586 BCE, Baalism and fertility cults were alive and well in Judah and Israel, Babylon and Persia, Baal and the bankers. When the elite are exiled to Babylon, they enter the world of Bel-Marduk. Bel is Akkadian for Baal. Daniel is renamed Belteshazzar, literally Bel protect his life, Daniel 1:7. So their priestly banker elite adapt to the local power structures, serving Bel in Babylon and later the Persian kings. They never truly left the Baal-Bel model of temple wealth extraction. They just kept dressing it in new garments. Baal mode, tax farming and temple banking. Throughout the ancient Near East and Canaan, temples were banks, tax offices and religious centers. The Levites and priests in Jerusalem ran the same kind of operations, tithes, sacrifices and loans at interest. Nehemiah 5 criticizes their usury even after the exile. In Babylon and Persia, Jewish elites became scribes, satraps, tax collectors, the backbone of the imperial administration, continuity of Baal-Bel in elite practice. What changed was the theological narrative for the masses. They increasingly condemned Baal as a rival god, but in practice the elite retained the temple-based hierarchical extractive system that was pioneered under Baal-El worship in Canaan. Even after returning from Babylon, the Second Temple in Jerusalem continued to operate like a Baal temple economically, centralized, tax-based, with wealth flowing upward to priestly elites. The Hebrews publicly rejected Baal while preserving the same economic and institutional model of Baal worship. Bull calf, Baal symbols persisted. Priestly banker elites ran temple economies. In exile, they adapted to Bel in Babylon and Persian satrapies. Even in Jesus' time, he denounces the den of robbers in the temple, still a Baal/Bel type operation. After Tyre, Phoenicia founded Carthage as their African operational base. They created trading networks that connected Atlantic Europe with Indian Ocean Asia. They even circumnavigated Africa during the Persian period. From about 5 to 300 AD, the same bloodlines that had operated as priests and military commanders evolved into the world's first true banking houses. The Murashu and Ejibi families of Babylon operated sophisticated financial institutions that provided loans, managed estates, collected taxes, and facilitated international trade. But these weren't just business enterprises. They were the operational evolution of the temple banking system that had operated since Hammurabi, now adapted to the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Persian Empire. The same families that had controlled religious institutions now controlled financial institutions, using business relationships instead of religious authority to maintain their extraction systems. The documentary evidence from this period is overwhelming. Thousands of cuneiform tablets detail complex financial operations involving interest rates, collateral requirements, foreclosure procedures, and international currency exchange. And when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the Judean scribes and financiers simply shifted their allegiance to Persia. The Persian kings inherited the Murashu Hebrew apparatus intact, even using it to govern their vast multi-ethnic empire. The priest-banker caste operated seamlessly under Persian rule, financing agriculture, maintaining records, mediating disputes, and funneling tribute back to Persepolis. Here, the Hebrews and the Murashu represent two facets of the same phenomenon: a mobile, literate, endogamous elite who controlled wealth and knowledge on behalf of the empire. They served not only as accountants and lawyers, but also as theologians, sanctifying imperial extraction by draping it in divine law, It is no coincidence that the later Kalonymos family, who appear in Italy and then the Rhineland centuries later, trace their lineage to exile from Judea. Their name, meaning good name, is both a claim of legitimacy and a reminder of their priestly roots. But those roots were forged in Babylon and polished in Persia, where the Phoenician Hebrew scribal tradition merged with Mesopotamian temple finance into the hybrid institution we would later recognize in medieval banking houses. What the Hebrews learned in Babylon was simple and devastatingly effective. The gods sit atop temples, the temples sit atop vaults, the vaults sit atop the people, and all are ruled by the same bloodlines. From this crucible emerged a priestly banker elite that would dominate the financial and religious infrastructure of empires for the next 2,000 years. They entered Babylon as captives, but left as architects of the system, ready to carry their craft into Persia, into Rome, and eventually into the vaults of Europe. When Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar, 2 Kings 24:14, the exile was not random devastation, but elite capture. The Babylonian Empire deliberately relocated Jewish nobles, priests, and craftsmen, the financial and administrative class, to serve its bureaucracy. The Babylonian Talmud itself notes, some Jews prospered under Babylon and didn't want to return, Sanhedrin 94a, highlighting that many became bankers, tax agents, and scribes embedded in the empire. Jeremiah even instructed the exiles to settle, build houses, and seek the welfare of the city, Jeremiah 29:4-7, showing that Babylonian exile was a strategic repositioning rather than destruction. Thus, Babylon became not only a city of exile, but an administrative capital of Jewish life. Babylon's literate, urban, contract-based society shaped Jewish law. The Talmud Bavli was rooted in Babylonian administrative and accounting logic. Babylonian scholars became sharp precisely because of their mobility and integration, Sanhedrin 24a. Babylonian legal practices, for example, dating documents by the king's regnal year, and its financial infrastructure deeply influenced Jewish halachic legal frameworks. Even after the return to Judea under Ezra and Nehemiah, the intellectual and spiritual center of Judaism remained in Babylon for centuries. The later Geonim, heads of the great Babylonian academies of Sura and Pumbedita, formalized Jewish law, consolidating Babylon's role as a second Jerusalem. From within this Babylon-Persian system emerged Mordecai and Esther, whose story, Book of Esther, illustrates Jewish infiltration of the Persian imperial elite. Mordecai, descended from King Saul, was already stationed inside the citadel of Susa, the administrative capital, acting as a court official and later elevated to vizier, the second most powerful man overseeing imperial taxation. Esther's strategic placement in the harem, hiding her identity at first, allowed her and Mordecai to overturn Haman's attempt to eliminate Jewish financial administrators, Esther 3:9, and secure Jewish control over Persian finance. The transfer of the king's signet ring to Mordecai symbolized Jewish oversight of imperial administration, echoing Joseph in Egypt and prefiguring the Kalonymos dynasty in medieval Europe. After Cyrus's decree allowing Jews to return to Judea, only about 42,000 actually returned, Ezra 2:64-65. Most stayed, particularly the wealthy merchant and administrative classes, because of their embedded power in Babylon. They had become indispensable to Persian administration as scribes, tax farmers, and bankers, roles documented in the Murashu archive. Thus, Babylon became the de facto headquarters of Judaism even after the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem. This vault reboot cemented Babylon as the intellectual, spiritual, and financial center of Judaism through the Geonic period and beyond. This pattern of embedded elite administrators, seen in Babylon with Daniel and Nehemiah, in Persia with Mordecai and Esther, and later in Europe with the Kalonymos family, reflects an unbroken strategy of financial and political influence, maintaining cultural distinction while serving empires at the highest levels. A Jewish scribe, he serves under 4 successive imperial kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus, without ever losing favor, exemplifying the role Jewish elites played in managing the imperial machine. Daniel embodies the ideal vault keeper, a master of law, calendar, and dreams, ledgers, indispensable to rulers regardless of dynasty. At the same time, Jewish families like the Murashu of Nippur operated what is arguably the most well-documented financial house of the ancient world. Their archive, discovered in the late 19th century, contains over 800 tablets spanning at least 4 generations, approximately 180 years, showing contracts, loans, and land transactions. The Murashu family served under both Babylonian and Persian kings, proving how Jewish elites maintained continuity even as empires rose and fell. Their business model, blending temple banking, land leasing, and international credit, set the standard for later Jewish banking families like the Kalonimos in Europe. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, the Jews were not expelled from their vault headquarters. They were invited deeper into the imperial apparatus. Many remained in Babylon and Persia, even after being allowed to return to Judea, preferring their secure position within the vault. Babylon became the seat of the Geonim centuries later, maintaining its role as a Jewish intellectual and financial hub long after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. As the Persian Empire absorbed Babylon, Jewish and Phoenician elites adapted again, splitting their operations between Persia's overland Silk Road vaults and the Western Mediterranean's maritime networks. From here, the Phoenician branch expanded into Carthage and beyond, carrying the same vault principles, the same scribal traditions, and the same bloodlines westward into Africa and Europe. The rise of the Persian Empire was yet another reset orchestrated from the steppes, another northern wave overwriting earlier northern invaders and their elites, yet leaving the same vault networks intact at the core. Cyrus and his Achaemenid dynasty emerged from the Iranian plateau, itself a crossroads where earlier steppe Indo-European migrants, R1A-bearing Aryans, had long ago imposed themselves on the indigenous Elamite and Median populations. The Persians, carrying the same steppe genetic and cultural package, swept south and west, absorbing the remnants of Assyria and Babylon in a single generation. Yet despite their military conquest, the Persians didn't dismantle the Babylonian vault. They inherited it. Cyrus's famous decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem was not an act of charity, but a pragmatic recognition of their role as scribes, bankers, and temple administrators. Many Jews chose to remain in Babylon because by now it was the headquarters of the vault. In fact, under Persian rule, the Jewish scribal banker class flourished further. Families like the Murashu of Nippur continued their operations seamlessly under the new regime, proving how the vault was dynasty-proof. Persian kings like Darius and Xerxes relied heavily on these Babylonian scribes, bankers, and priests to manage the vast empire, just as Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar had before them. The Persians even formalized the vault as imperial ideology through Zoroastrianism, a theological innovation in which all opposites, light and dark, good and evil, were reconciled under a single, timeless principle. This mirrored the vault's operational philosophy: control both sides of every conflict, mediate between competing powers, and extract profit from all outcomes. Zoroastrianism was originally polytheistic, and like all the other polytheistic religions, followed suit. We see this explicitly in their operations along the Silk Road. Under Persian protection, Jewish, Phoenician, and later Sogdian merchant bankers created the first truly global overland vault network, reaching from the Mediterranean to China. These families operated simultaneously as tax collectors, lenders, and intelligence agents for the empire, ensuring that even as power shifted from Babylonian to Persian hands, the underlying machinery of extraction and domination never missed a beat. When the Persians emerged in the 6th century BCE, themselves part of a new wave of northern steppe-derived elites, they did not destroy the pre-existing temple banking systems of Babylon, Phoenicia, or Judea. Why? Because these systems were not truly indigenous in the first place. The priestly scribes, temple bankers, and maritime merchant elites in Babylon, Phoenicia, and Judea were already the descendants of the original Yamnaya Amorite Hyksos conqueror class. This was a single, mobile, self-replicating vault network that had embedded itself inside the sacred and economic institutions of every major Near Eastern polity for 1,500 years by the time of Cyrus the Great. So when Cyrus overthrew Babylon, 539 BCE, and claimed the mantle of King of Kings, he was not toppling a foreign order. He was simply assuming the helm of the same steppe-derived temple scribal military control system that his own ancestors had been aligned with for centuries. In practice, the Phoenician temple merchants continued operating the navy and Mediterranean commerce. The Judean scribes, like those who compiled Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, administered law, taxation, and ideology for the interior. The Babylonian bankers, for example the Murashu family, ran land management, debt slavery schemes, and estate administration. These were not indigenous Semitic vaults, but rather the steppe-implanted temple banker class, still intact after centuries of resets and new overlords. When the Persians conquered, they simply let these families continue their operations because they were already part of the same elite network. The Murashu firm based in Nippur is an excellent example. Over 180 years and at least 4 generations, it controlled estates, loans, tax farming, and administrative contracts for the Persian crown, clearly plugged into the imperial apparatus and tied to the same vault lineages seen earlier in Babylon and later in Roman Judea and medieval Europe. On the Mediterranean coast, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon were given autonomy in exchange for their fleet and trade. On the interior, the Judean scribes returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, not as refugees but as the authorized administrators of the imperial province of Yehud. Both branches of the vault operated seamlessly under the new Persian king, just as they had under Babylonian, Assyrian, Hyksos, and Akkadian kings before him. Perhaps more than any other people, the Sogdians capitalized on the opportunities of the Silk Roads, oiling the wheels of global trade and exchange, shaping arts, fashions, lifestyles, technologies, and religious ideas far from their homeland. But Cyrus's conquest did not stop at Babylon. He pushed eastward into Central Asia, incorporating the region known as Sogdia, a strip of fertile river valleys and trade crossroads stretching from Samarkand and Bukhara to the Pamirs. With this, Cyrus added a new node to the vault, the Proto-Sogdian merchant scribe elite. In the same way Judeans became indispensable scribes and Babylonian firms like the Murashu family continued under Persian rule, the Sogdians were integrated as the Eastern partners in the imperial machine, specialists of the Silk Road, connecting Persia with China, India, and beyond. Who were the Sogdians? Sogdia or Sogdiana was not an empire. It was a confederation of city principalities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kesh, and others, situated between the Oxus, Amu Darya, and Jaxartes, Sirdaria rivers. They were farmers, craftsmen, caravan masters, but above all they were scribes and merchants, the vault keepers of Central Asia. Although Sogdia lay at the edge of the Achaemenid Empire, their role mirrored that of the Judeans and Phoenicians, masters of contracts, credit, and diplomacy, multilingual translators and intermediaries, temple-linked networks of finance and trust, dynasty-proof, able to serve Achaemenids, Greeks, Turks, and Chinese in turn. When the First Turkic Khaganate and later the Western Turkic Khaganate rose in the 6th-7th centuries CE, they formally adopted Sogdian as their language of diplomacy, record-keeping, and coinage, just as the Babylonians used Aramaic and the Romans Latin. This shows how indispensable the Sogdians were as the scribes and notaries of the steppe, the Sogdians as religious vault keepers. Beyond their economic and administrative role, the Sogdians became the scribes of world religions. They transmitted Buddhism into China, carried Nestorian Christianity, Church of the East, through Central Asia, spread Manichaeism, a syncretic Persian religion, along the Silk Road. At home, they followed a hybridized Zoroastrianism and participated in Shaivism, Judaism, and other cults. In the Tang dynasty, Sogdian tombs in China show Zoroastrian rituals alongside Chinese Buddhist iconography, reflecting their ability to serve multiple religious institutions as scribes, translators, and bankers of belief. In other words, they were to Buddhism and Christianity what the Judeans were to the Torah and the Phoenicians to the cult of Melkart, middlemen of the sacred. Comparison table, vault keepers across the empire role, Judeans, Phoenicians, Sogdians, language of law, Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Sogdian financial networks, Babylon, Persia, Judea, Tyre, Carthage, Rome, Samarkand, Chang'an religious function, Torah scribes, temple bankers, Baal cult translators and scribes for Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, imperial client Babylon, Persia, Rome, Persia, Greece, Rome, Persia, Turks, Tang continuity, Geonim, Europe, Carthage, Europe, Sogdian, Uyghur, Silk Road diaspora. The Sogdians thrived because they understood, like the Murashu firm of Nippur, how to serve the empire without appearing threatening. They never created an empire of their own. Instead, they embedded themselves within others. Their contracts, like the marriage contracts found in Sogdian letters, show their literacy and legal expertise. Their merchant caravans spanned thousands of miles, yet their city principalities remained small and independent. Their scribes minted coins, wrote official decrees, and translated texts for Persians, Turks, and Chinese alike. They mirrored the Murashu and Ajibi archives of Babylon, a web of multilingual, multi-religious families who managed credit, land, and contracts over generations while dynasties rose and fell around them. Sogdian and Steppe elite sites, archaeological finds in Sogdia, for example, Samarkand, Bukhara, and along the Oxus River have uncovered elite burials with elongated skulls, often accompanied by luxurious grave goods, gold ornaments, and imported silks. Yuezhi and Kushan kings. The Yuezhi, a nomadic Indo-European people who migrated from the western steppe into Bactria and founded the Kushan Empire, show clear evidence of cranial deformation among their royal lineages. The Kushan kings, who ruled vast swaths of Central and South Asia, 1st–3rd centuries CE, are depicted in coins and statuary with visibly elongated skulls, a visual marker of their legitimacy and steppe ancestry. Huns and Hephthalites. The Huns, who devastated Europe in the 4th–5th centuries CE, and their cousins the Hephthalites, white Huns in Central Asia, also practiced cranial elongation, another clue to their shared steppe vault heritage. Tarim Basin, Xiaohe, and Lulan mummies. The famous mummies of the Tarim Basin in western China, Carta 2000 BCE 200 CE, display light pigmentation, European-like features, and elongated skulls, suggesting a mix of Indo-European genetic and cultural traits, deeply embedded in the Silk Road elite. But it wasn't just the Sogdians. Before we leave Persia and move on to Greek, Roman, and Khaganate continuity, we would be remiss to leave this section without establishing skull vault continuity across epochs, the Alkon kings, vault heirs of Persia and Sogdia. As the Persian Achaemenid Empire fell to Alexander and then to successive empires, the eastern vault shifted further toward the Sogdian Steppe Silk Road nexus. By the 5th–6th centuries CE, the Alkon Huns emerged, heirs of the Hephthalites and Kushans, ruling parts of Gandhara, Bactria, and northwest India. The Alkon kings, c. 400–500 CE, are a direct link in this chain. They controlled the trade and tax routes between Persia and India. They issued coins inscribed in Bactrian and Brahmi scripts, often depicting themselves with elongated skulls, marking their elite vault lineage. Their material culture blended Sogdian, Persian, and Indian motifs, showing they inherited both the administrative and symbolic power of the earlier vault networks. Some of their kings, like Mihirakula, are remembered in Indian texts for both violent conquests and temple patronage. In a way, the Alkon kings were the Persian vault's heirs on its eastern flank, marrying Sogdian literacy and steppe mobility with control over Gandharan religious hubs. Recent research has underscored the significance of the Iranian plateau and surrounding highlands, the literal crossroads of Neanderthal, Denisovan, and Homo sapiens lineages, as the earliest known vault bearers. The rugged Zagros and Caucasus Mountains not only served as a genetic hybridization zone, but also as the birthplace of the elite cranial elongation practice that would become a mark of sovereignty from Mesopotamia to Mongolia. Evidence. At Chegasofla Cemetery, southwestern Iran, approximately 4,700–3,700 BCE, archaeologists uncovered the earliest confirmed artificial cranial elongation on the plateau. A young woman buried with a modified and hinge-fractured skull, Alirezazadeh and Vadati Nasab, 2025. Earlier instances from Arini 1 cave, Armenia, Trialeti, Georgia, and Shanidar cave, Iraq, illustrate the deep antiquity of vault lineage traits in the Balkan-Caucasus steppe Iranian corridor. It is striking that the vault lineages chose to elongate their skulls in ways that echo the natural cranial proportions of Neanderthals and Denisovans, ancient humans whose genes and legends linger in the Eurasian memory. Whether this resemblance was deliberate or coincidental remains unknown. This mountainous corridor not only fostered hybrid vigor from archaic humans, but also became the highland nursery for the vault keepers who descended into the lowlands to dominate emergent city-states. Over thousands of years, This lineage spread its vault-marking practices westward into the Balkans, Vlasak, northward onto the steppes, Yamnaya, Makop, eastward into Sogdia and the Tarim Basin, and eventually as far as Bavaria and Gotland. Into Europe, Gotland and Bavarian Viking marriages. By the early medieval period, 8th–10th centuries CE, we see vault bloodlines resurfacing in northern Europe, embedded in the ruling families of Gotland, Sweden, Denmark, and even Bavaria. The so-called Gotland queens appear in both legend and archaeology as women of Sogdian and steppe descent, marrying into Norse royal lines. Gotland graves contain Central Asian silk, elongated skulls, and genetic markers consistent with earlier Sogdian and Alcon populations. In Bavaria, some Merovingian-era burials show elongated skulls alongside Central Asian jewelry, suggesting elite wives or concubines from the vault networks were imported as prestige brides. These marriages served the same purpose they had for centuries, embedding the vault within the ruling class of yet another empire, ensuring continuity of their merchant, scribe, banker role through dynastic legitimacy. Why it matters. This section completes the picture. Akhenaten and Tutthia, R1B pharaohs, to Amorite elongation in reliefs, Sogdians in the east and from Chega Sofla in Neolithic Iran to Yamnaya Kurgans in the steppe, to Akhenaten and Tut's vaults in Egypt, to Sogdian scribes and Alcon kings in Central Asia, to Bavarian queens and Gotland Viking brides. It's the same signal over 5,000 years, elongated skulls, often paired with Indo-European/steppe genetic markers, temple or priestly status, and control over finance, ritual, and contracts. This isn't just a biological quirk. It's a dynastic glyph, a way to visibly mark their claim to the vault lineage that rules through writing, ritual, and commerce across empires and eras. Yamnaya as a hybrid confederation from the start, combining EHG and CHG Caucasus ancestry approximately 5,000–4,000 BCE. Their expansion was both genetic and cultural, using a patriarchal elite system to dominate local populations in Europe, India, and the Near East. Later, Zagros Iranian ancestry enters Levant during Late Bronze collapse, suggesting elite reinforcements from the east. Invasions into the Levant and Egypt were confederated, Semitic-speaking tribes, Indo-European warriors, local vassals, Amorites, Hyksos, Retgenu, Hittite, Canaanite, Phoenician alliances. Yamnaya's model of absorbing local elites repeated in Anatolia and Levant. DNA evidence shows R1B in Levant in Bronze Age, showing elite male lineages established there. Parallels later steppe confederations, Khazars, Alans, Huns, Goths. Mobile elite absorbing and ruling locals. Elite tools, religion, priesthood, marriage, temple banking, Ejibi, Shakir, Murashu, Cohen, used to maintain power. Babylonian and Persian banking elite continuity, with families surviving regime changes while serving rulers. Kurgan confederations were not ethnically uniform but politically and ritually cohesive, operating like later European colonial carve-ups. Gimbutas material, Kurgan group in northern Caucasus linked to Trans-Caucasian culture and parent to Kassites, Cimmerians, Hyksos, tying steppe confederation directly to Near Eastern history. Even before Europe and Anatolia expansion, already mixed with North Pontic and Caucasian elements, showing long-standing hybrid identity. The religious distribution from 2500 BC Semitic Canaanite El worship through the modern era is not that difficult to reconstruct. Around 2350 BCE, Sargon and the Semitic Akkadians seize Sumer and insert El worship into the Sumerian pantheon. Not only did they put El in higher order than the Enki and Inanna pantheon, they also changed the religion to one of Deus Pater, storm sky father gods. This was a huge shift from the nature-based mythology the Sumerians observed for 1,000 years before they came, the balance and the peaceful religions which were more metaphoric and less actual sky being monitoring and judging. Gimbutas spoke about this transition, and this is right near the beginning of the wave. She over-attributed feminist and matrilineal and missed the balance that these religions focused on. Then come the Amorites, who are really just the Matu the Sumerians already described fighting back in approximately 2500 BCE, taking over after the Akkadians, with a brief interlude of Gutian highland Iranian influence. The Amorites are also the Hyksos who enter Egypt. Egyptian records and Near Eastern texts show communication between these groups. Even rabbinic sources sometimes identify Abraham as an Amorite. His journey to Egypt reflects a cultural memory of the Habiru, wanderers, and Hyksos migrations into Egypt. Egypt responds by building walls and fortresses to defend against these Asiatics in the early 2nd millennium BCE. The Hyksos bring El and Baal traditions into Egypt, c. 1650 BCE, and eventually merge with the Yahweh-worshipping Shasu, c. 1400 BCE, who also passed through Egypt and Canaan. These Semitic tribes, Amorites, Hyksos, Shasu, were all Canaanites, preserving and spreading the much older El-Ugaritic pantheon. These religious forms continue into Phoenician scribal traditions, which transmit them into Greece, temple banking, writing systems after the Dorian invasions. Dorians needed writing and cultural training. Cadmus, the mythological founding story of Greece, presents a Sidonian or Tyrian Phoenician as the giver of time, writing, and knowledge. This is echoed in Herodotus, saying that Africa is the home of gods, calendar, and diff. Greece knowledge. Phoenicians had extensive time dealing with Egyptians and made their Proto-Sinaitic script from it. Greece passes them to Rome. In the meantime, Persia, sitting at the center of these networks, and the West were bound by the Susa weddings and earlier Babylonian hegemony under Esarhaddon, who forged a 16-state confederation that included Israelites, Canaanites, and Phoenicians. The Sea Peoples' invasions destabilize Egypt and the Levant. The Chaldeans move into Babylon, becoming scribes and administrators. These same scribal banking elites are absorbed successively by Babylon, then by Persia, and later by Greece and Rome, often administering the same lands from Greece to Iran. It's the same confederation of Steppe/Indo-European Yamnaya elites and their Semitic allies appearing under new names, with mixed lineages and local adaptations. The Temple of Saturn in Rome essentially continues the Temple of Baal. Semitic bankers and tax farmers control this through line, moving seamlessly from Babylon to Persia, Greece, and Rome. After Rome, they resurface in Khazar and later in the Holy Roman Empire as the court Jews, like the Colonymus family, Judean banking exiles from Rome and Babylon. What we see is not a series of disconnected religious revolutions, but rather a syncretic and adaptive elite ideology, rooted in the older El Baal Yahweh pantheon, reshaped and rebranded to fit changing regimes and technologies of power. Ancient aliens? Nope. Kurgan warlords, steppe charioteers, temple bankers and scribes, Cometian native Egyptian builders, miraculous skyfather gods? Nope. Institutionalized power wrapped in myth, forced onto conquered peoples. God-given wars? Nope. Resource extraction, vault control and manufactured ideology. Next episode, we will continue Greece through Rome and Byzantine Rome, through Khazars and Mongols, back to the Holy Roman Empire as a node for the Byzantine, right into Templars, Venetians, Conversos, and Ottomans. We wrap up in the corporate colonial era with the Dutch and British East India Company, and the transition into the modern day and the New World Order. Kurgan's latest new skin, NATO, and the orchestrated global order of the newest temple bankers after World War II.